I was chosen by Truman for MJ-12. What I discovered about alien technology changed me forever. Before I begin, I need you to do something for me. Comment right now and tell me where you're listening to this. Your car? Your bedroom at 2 a.m.? Walking your dog? It doesn't matter where. Just tell me. Because what I'm about to share was recorded in 2019 by a man named Robert J. Hargrove, just 3 weeks before he died, under circumstances his family still questions. He was 90 years old. For 72 years, he carried secrets that could rewrite human history. This is his final testimony, released now because, as he said in his last recorded words, "They're coming back, and you deserve to know what's been hidden from you. If this recording disappears tomorrow, at least someone will have heard the truth before they erase it again." What follows is his story, in his own words, recorded in a small apartment in Albuquerque, where he lived under an assumed name since 1952. My name is Robert James Hargrove, and I didn't survive long enough to see this published. But you're hearing it now, and that means something went right. The telegram arrived at my office at Consolidated Aircraft in Boston on September 18, 1947, at precisely 2:47 in the afternoon. I remember the exact time because I was in the middle of reviewing stress calculations for a new wing design, and the interruption annoyed me until I saw the delivery boy's face, pale, nervous, like he'd been told this message could start or end a war. The envelope was unmarked except for a red stripe along the seal, the kind of classification marker I'd only seen twice during my work on the P-51 Mustang project during the war. My hands were shaking as I opened it, and the message inside was typewritten in capital letters with spacing that suggested each word had been chosen with surgical precision. White House requires your immediate presence. Stop matter of national security. Stop report Union Station platform, 7 tomorrow, 0600, stop tell no one. Stop confirmation code, Majestic. I read it 3 times, looking for some indication that this was a mistake or a test or possibly even a joke from one of my colleagues who knew I'd worked on classified projects during the war. But the paper quality was government issue. The code word Majestic wasn't something anyone outside certain circles would know to use. And the red stripe seal was authentic enough that attempting to verify it through normal channels would probably trigger more problems than it would solve. I'd been involved in enough defense work to understand that when the federal government summons you with zero notice and explicit instructions to tell no one, you have exactly 2 choices: comply immediately or prepare for your life to become very complicated in ways that don't involve lawyers you can afford. I chose compliance, though that decision would haunt me for the next 72 years. The difficult part wasn't the sudden travel arrangements or even the classification protocols. It was lying to Dorothy. We'd been married 14 years by then, and I'd never kept secrets from her except for the obvious wartime necessities that everyone understood came with my work. But this felt different, more absolute, carrying a weight that suggested the consequences of disclosure would extend beyond professional reprimand into territory I didn't want to imagine. I told her the company was sending me to Washington for emergency consultations on a military contract, that it was probably just bureaucratic nonsense, but that I'd be back in a few days. She looked at me with those blue eyes that had always been able to detect my lies, and for a moment I thought she would press for details I couldn't provide. Instead, she kissed me and said, "Be careful, Bob, and come home to us." I promised I would, having no idea that the man who made that promise would effectively die in Washington, replaced by someone who'd seen things that made normal life seem like a comfortable fiction we maintain to avoid confronting what's really out there. The train from Boston to Washington departed exactly on schedule at 600, and I found my assigned compartment already occupied by a man in a dark suit who introduced himself only as Mr. Stevens from State Department. He was probably CIA. The agency had only been established 2 months earlier, but already their people had that particular quality of watchful silence that made you understand they were trained to notice everything while revealing nothing. We didn't speak for the first 3 hours of the journey, both of us pretending to read newspapers, while the Massachusetts countryside gave way to Connecticut and then New York. Around Hartford, Stevens finally broke the silence. "Dr. Hargrove, you're aware that discussing this trip with anyone, including your wife, would constitute a federal crime." I confirmed that I understood. "Good. What you're about to be briefed on is classified at levels that didn't exist 6 months ago. The classification was created specifically for this material." "Do you understand what that means?" I understood perfectly. It meant that whatever I was being brought to Washington to see or hear or analyze was significant enough that the federal government had invented entirely new categories of secrecy to contain it. Stevens continued. You were selected because of your expertise in aircraft propulsion and advanced metallurgy, your security clearance from the P-51 project, and because certain people believe you can be trusted with information that would cause significant public disruption if mishandled. He pulled out a leather folder and handed me a document that I had to sign before reading. Standard procedure for classified briefings. Except this acknowledgement was more comprehensive than anything I'd seen during wartime. I was agreeing to criminal penalties including life imprisonment or potentially death for unauthorized disclosure, accepting that normal constitutional protections might not apply to cases involving this material, and acknowledging that signing this document created obligations that would persist for the rest of my natural life, regardless of changes in employment or political administration. The weight of what I was signing hit me as my pen touched paper. This wasn't temporary wartime security. This was permanent binding to secrets that apparently transcended normal government operations. But curiosity and patriotic duty won over caution, and I signed my name with the flourish I'd used on my MIT diploma 17 years earlier, not yet understanding that I was effectively signing away my right to ever speak freely about what came next. Stevens collected the document, placed it back in his folder, and said something that made my blood run cold despite the warm September air. Dr. Hargrove, in approximately 6 hours you're going to meet President Truman. He's going to tell you things that will change your understanding of humanity's place in the universe. My advice is to listen carefully, ask your questions, and then decide whether you want to be part of what comes next. Because once you're briefed, there's no walking away. The knowledge becomes part of you, and you become part of the apparatus built to manage that knowledge. We arrived at Union Station around 1400 hours, and instead of the normal exit procedures, Stevens led me through service corridors I didn't know existed, past security checkpoints where men in suits examined credentials without speaking, into a parking garage where an unmarked black Cadillac was waiting with engine running and windows tinted dark enough to prevent any observation of occupants. The driver said nothing as we merged into Washington traffic, and I noticed that Stevens kept watching the side mirrors with an intensity that suggested we might be followed or that he needed to confirm we weren't. 20 minutes later, we pulled through gates that I recognized as belonging to the White House complex. But we didn't stop at the main building. We continued to a smaller structure that I later learned was the West Wing, recently renovated, and housing offices that most tourists never knew existed. The waiting room where Stevens deposited me was surprisingly modest. Wooden chairs, a secretary's desk occupied by a woman who typed without looking up, walls decorated with portraits of previous presidents that seemed to be watching me with expressions ranging from approval to warning. I sat there for 30 minutes, checking my watch and trying to control my breathing, running through possible explanations for why the President of the United States would personally summon an aircraft engineer with no political connections or particular fame beyond being competent at calculating stress loads and propulsion efficiency. The only conclusion that made sense was that this involved some new weapons program, probably related to the emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union, something so advanced that it required presidential oversight and the kind of security apparatus that Stevens represented. I was wrong about everything except the Soviet connection, but I wouldn't understand just how wrong until I was sitting in the Oval Office 20 minutes later, listening to Harry S. Truman tell me things that violated every assumption I'd ever made about humanity being alone in the cosmos and in control of our own technological development. The door to the inner office opened, and Stevens gestured for me to enter. Inside, the president sat behind his desk, flanked by 2 men in military uniforms. One I recognized from newspapers as General Hoyt Vandenberg, recently appointed Chief of Staff of the new Air Force, and the other introduced as Rear Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, Director of Central Intelligence. Truman stood and shook my hand with the firm grip of a man who'd grown up doing manual labor, and his eyes had a directness that made it clear this wasn't ceremonial. He wanted to take my measure before trusting me with whatever came next. Dr. Hargrove, Truman began without preamble, thank you for coming on such short notice. I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer honestly even if you think the answer might sound crazy. He paused, and I nodded my understanding. Do you believe we're alone in the universe? It was a strange opening for a presidential briefing, and my mind immediately went to philosophy and religion rather than practical matters of national security. I gave him the answer any educated man in 1947 would give, that the universe was vast enough that other life probably existed somewhere, but that the distances involved made contact unlikely in any time frame relevant to human civilization. Truman exchanged glances with Vandenberg and Hillenkoetter, and something in those exchanged looks made my stomach tighten with the realization that my answer had been evaluated and found to be exactly what they'd hoped to hear. Truman walked to a wall safe I hadn't noticed, worked the combination lock with practiced efficiency, and pulled out a folder stamped with classification markings I didn't recognize. He placed it on his desk but didn't open it immediately, instead looking at me with an expression that mixed gravity with something that looked disturbingly like sympathy. "Bob, can I call you Bob?" I nodded. "Bob, what I'm about to tell you is known to fewer than 24 people in the entire United States government. Most of my cabinet doesn't know. Congress doesn't know. Our allies don't know. And it needs to stay that way because if this information became public right now, the results would be catastrophic for social order, religious institutions, and international stability." He opened the folder and turned it toward me, and I found myself looking at photographs that my brain initially refused to process as real. The images showed metallic debris scattered across desert sand, not the kind of wreckage you'd expect from any aircraft I'd ever seen, but fragments that looked almost organic in their curves and surfaces, covered in symbols that weren't from any alphabet or technical notation I recognized. More disturbing were the close-up photographs showing material properties that shouldn't have been possible with any metallurgy I knew. Metal that appeared to be both rigid and flexible simultaneously, surfaces that seemed to reflect light in patterns that created depth where there should have been flatness, and in one photograph, a piece of material that had been photographed mid-crumpling and mid-recovery, as if it possessed memory and was actively returning to its original shape. "This," Truman said quietly, "is from Roswell, New Mexico, July 8, 1947, about 2 months ago. A rancher named Mac Brazel found it scattered across his property after a storm. The Army Air Force initially reported recovering a flying disc, then changed their story to a weather balloon within 24 hours. You probably read about it in the papers. I had. It had been a minor story that disappeared quickly, replaced by more pressing concerns about Soviet expansion and domestic economic recovery. The weather balloon story was necessary to control panic and prevent Soviet intelligence from learning what we'd actually recovered. But Bob, it wasn't a weather balloon, and it wasn't ours, and it wasn't Soviet." He let that hang in the air while I tried to process implication that seemed to violate not just security classification, but fundamental assumptions about reality. General Vandenberg spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the clipped precision of career military. "Dr. Hargrove, we need you to understand something that very few people in this building have accepted yet. Roswell was real. The debris recovered is of non-terrestrial origin, manufactured using processes and materials that are decades or possibly centuries beyond our current capabilities. But here's what's really important, and why you're sitting in this office right now." He paused, and I could see him choosing his next words with the care of someone defusing a bomb. Roswell wasn't the first. It wasn't even the first this year, and it probably won't be the last. Admiral Hillenkoetter picked up the thread. "We have confirmation of at least 4 other recovery operations between May and August of this year alone. Plains of San Agustin in May, Paradise Valley, Arizona in July, almost simultaneously with Roswell. White Sands in August during routine weapons testing. Texarkana, Texas, late August, with civilian witnesses we're still trying to contain. Each incident involved similar materials, similar design principles, and in 2 cases, biological remains that are clearly not human, not animal, and not anything our biologists can classify within known evolutionary frameworks." I sat there in the Oval Office trying to reconcile what I was hearing with everything I'd learned at MIT. Everything I'd experienced during the war, everything my religious upbringing had taught me about humanity's place in creation. The President of the United States and top military officials were telling me that we'd recovered alien spacecraft, multiple spacecraft, and that this wasn't speculation. Part 2, the other incidents. The flight to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, departed from a military airstrip outside Washington at 0400 the next morning, early enough that darkness still covered our movement, and late enough that anyone tracking my absence from Boston would assume I was still in meetings. The aircraft was a C-47 transport, with all identifying markings painted over, piloted by men who didn't introduce themselves and who maintained radio silence for the entire 2-hour flight. I sat in the cargo bay on a fold-down seat, alone except for the aluminum cases strapped to the floor that I assumed contained either equipment or documents too sensitive for normal transport channels. The isolation gave me time to process what Truman had told me, though processing is probably the wrong word. My mind kept circling the same impossible facts, trying to find some alternative explanation that would let me dismiss this as elaborate psychological testing or disinformation designed to assess my reliability under pressure. We landed as dawn was breaking across Ohio farmland, and I was immediately transferred to an unmarked sedan that drove through gates marked with warnings about authorized personnel and lethal force. Wright Field had been central to Air Force development during the war, but the section we entered was separated from the main base by additional fencing and guard posts that suggested this was base within a base, installation within installation. The briefing room was in a concrete bunker that had been built recently enough that you could still smell fresh paint mixing with the distinctive odor of classified spaces, coffee, cigarette smoke, and the particular tension that comes from people handling information that could get them killed if mishandled. 7 men were already seated around a conference table when I entered, and the introductions that followed read like a roster of American scientific and military power. Dr. Vannevar Bush, who'd coordinated wartime research including the Manhattan Project, served as scientific director. James Forrestal, Secretary of Defense, represented executive authority. General Hoyt Vandenberg I'd already met. The others included Rear Admiral Sidney Sowers, Dr. Detlev Bronk from Johns Hopkins, Gordon Gray from Psychological Warfare Operations, and a man introduced simply as Alan Dulles, whose agency affiliation wasn't specified, but whose presence suggested intelligence operations at the highest levels. These weren't men brought in to investigate possibilities. They were men assembled to manage certainties that most people would never be allowed to know existed. Bush conducted the briefing with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent decades turning complex science into actionable intelligence. He used a pointer and a wall-mounted map of the American Southwest, marked with red circles that represented what he called recovery sites. The pattern became immediately clear. All 5 incidents had occurred within a roughly 800-mile radius centered on New Mexico, all between May and August 1947. All involving similar debris and similar attempts by whatever created them to avoid populated areas. Gentlemen, Bush began, what we're dealing with is not invasion or attack. The trajectory analysis and impact patterns suggest mechanical failures, not hostile action. These craft, and we're now certain they are craft, appear to be experiencing catastrophic malfunctions at altitudes between 30,000 and 50,000 feet, possibly related to our increased testing of radar and atomic weapons in the region. The first incident at Plains of San Agustin in May had produced only fragments, pieces small enough to fit in briefcases, but significant enough that the rancher who found them knew immediately they weren't from any aircraft he'd ever seen. The military recovery team had swept a 3-mile radius and found approximately 40 pounds of material scattered across desert floor. Roswell in July was the largest recovery, the famous one that had briefly made newspapers before the weather balloon cover story contained public interest. The debris field there had stretched nearly 3/4 of a mile, suggesting something had broken apart at altitude before impacting ground. Paradise Valley, Arizona, had occurred almost simultaneously with Roswell, which raised disturbing questions about whether we were seeing increased activity or increased failure rates in whatever technology these visitors were using. White sands in August had been discovered by military personnel during routine weapons testing, which meant the recovery operation had been clean and complete with no civilian witnesses to manage or stories to contain. But Texarkana in late August had been messy. Multiple civilians had seen something fall from the sky trailing fire, and local police had reached the impact site before military teams could establish perimeter. The containment operation had involved confiscating cameras, threatening witnesses with prosecution under espionage laws, and in at least 2 cases, detaining civilians overnight for debriefing that was closer to interrogation. Forrestal interjected, "That incident taught us that we need to be faster, more aggressive, and willing to use resources that might make some people uncomfortable. We cannot allow this information to become public knowledge before we understand what we're dealing with, and before we've secured military advantage from the technology involved." After the briefing on incident locations and recovery operations, Bush led us to an adjacent building that had been converted into something between laboratory and museum, a space where the impossible was being catalogued, measured, and analyzed by men whose scientific training was being challenged in ways no university had prepared them for. The debris was organized by recovery site and material type, each piece tagged with classification numbers and storage protocols. Bush handed me white cotton gloves and warned me that some of the materials reacted to skin contact in ways that weren't fully understood yet. "Dr. Hargrove," he said, "I'm going to show you things that violate principles you learned at MIT. I need you to observe with an engineer's eye, but also with an engineer's openness, to discovering that our textbooks are incomplete." The first material he showed me looked like aluminum foil, but behaved like something alive. When crumpled into a ball and released, it unfolded itself back to perfect flatness within seconds, showing no creases or damage from deformation. I repeated the experiment 3 times, trying to find the mechanism: heat activation, shape memory alloy, some kind of internal structure, but the material was uniform throughout, showing no layers or embedded systems that would explain the recovery behavior. "We've subjected this to temperatures ranging from 200 to +600 Fahrenheit, Bush explained. "It behaves identically across the entire range. We've tried cutting it with industrial saws. The material simply won't separate. It's as if the molecular bonds are stronger than any force we can apply without destroying the equipment we're using to test it." The symbols were even more disturbing than the materials, because they suggested intelligence and intentionality rather than just advanced engineering. The markings appeared on several larger fragments, looking almost like hieroglyphics or mathematical notation, arranged in patterns that had geometric precision, but no correspondence to any human language or technical specification system. What made them particularly unsettling was that they seemed to shift slightly when viewed from different angles or under different lighting conditions, as if they contained more information than could be displayed in 2 dimensions simultaneously. Dr. Bronk had been studying them for weeks and had concluded they weren't decorative. They appeared to be instructions or labels, possibly indicating function or warning about hazards, but in a symbolic language that assumed the reader possessed knowledge we simply didn't have. The structural materials showed strength-to-weight ratios that made our best aircraft aluminum look primitive by comparison. Bush handed me a piece about the size of a paperback book, and the weight was so minimal, I initially thought it was hollow. "Approximately 1/3 the density of aluminum," Bush said, "but tensile strength that exceeds our best titanium alloys by factors we're still trying to measure accurately. We've hit this with hydraulic presses capable of 50,000 psi. No deformation. We've subjected it to impact testing with armor-piercing rounds. The rounds shattered. The material showed no damage." He paused, then added something that made my engineering training rebel against physical impossibility. "And here's what really keeps me awake at night. This material conducts electricity, but only in one direction. Flow electrons from point A to point B, they move normally. Reverse the polarity, and resistance becomes effectively infinite." The most inexplicable items were components that Bush's team had identified as possibly being power generation or light emission systems. They looked organic, curved surfaces that felt warm to touch, even though they'd been in storage at room temperature. Crystalline structures embedded in the metal that caught light and seemed to amplify it internally. When placed in completely dark environment and observed with night vision equipment, these components glowed faintly, suggesting either radioactive decay or some kind of energy storage that remained active even after whatever accident had scattered these materials across the desert. "We don't know how to turn them off," Bush admitted. "We don't know what fuel they're using, if they're using fuel at all, and we don't know if they're safe to handle long-term. 2 of our researchers have developed unusual symptoms after extended exposure: headaches, vision problems, one case of what appears to be radiation sickness, except the dosimeters show nothing." As I stood in that laboratory surrounded by materials that shouldn't exist according to everything I'd been taught about physics and engineering, I felt my worldview performing the same kind of catastrophic failure that had brought these craft down from the sky. Every piece of debris was a question that led to more questions. Every analysis revealing not answers, but deeper layers of ignorance about what we were really dealing with. Bush placed his hand on my shoulder and said something that captured exactly what I was feeling. "Dr. Hargrove, 6 months ago, I believed I understood the fundamental principles governing matter and energy in this universe. Now I understand that we're children playing with toys we found in the attic of a house we didn't build, trying to figure out how things work while the people who actually made them are somewhere out there, possibly watching us fumble through this process." He gestured at the debris spread across the laboratory tables. "This is why you're here. We need minds that can look at impossible things and find ways to make them possible. Because whatever else this represents, it's also the greatest scientific and military opportunity in human history. And we're in a race against the Soviets to understand it first." The call came at 0230 hours on November 14, 1947, pulling me from the first deep sleep I'd managed in a week. A rancher named Thomas Whitfield outside of Snowflake, Arizona, had contacted local authorities about a metal dome partially exposed on his property after unusual erosion from recent storms. What made this different from the usual parade of false alarms and misidentified farm equipment was that Whitfield claimed the object had been there since before he bought the land in 1923. He'd always assumed it was some kind of old mining equipment or water tank, but the storms had exposed enough that he could see it wasn't anything built by human hands. The Army had sent a reconnaissance team that confirmed with a single photograph transmitted by secure wire. This wasn't debris from a crash. This was something intact. By 0600, I was airborne in a military transport heading southwest, accompanied by Dr. Bush, a security team of 30 men, and equipment that suggested we were preparing for excavation rather than simple recovery. Bush briefed me during the flight. "Bob, everything we've examined so far has been fragments, pieces torn apart by impact and atmospheric entry. If this is what Whitfield's photographs suggest, we're about to see one of these craft in its complete form for the first time. That means functional systems, intact navigation, possibly even biological specimens if there were occupants." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It also means we need to move fast. The longer that object sits exposed, the greater the chance of compromise. Civilian curiosity, Soviet intelligence, or whoever built these things deciding they want it back." The excavation site, when we arrived, looked like a military operation disguised as geological survey. Trucks, earth-moving equipment, generators, and portable lighting systems that could turn night into day if needed. But the work was being done during darkness, with strict protocols about light discipline and aerial observation. Nearly 200 men worked in coordinated shifts, removing earth from around the object with care that bordered on archaeological, photographing and measuring every layer as it was exposed. By the time I reached the perimeter around 1400 hours, they'd uncovered roughly 60% of a disc-shaped object, approximately 40 feet in diameter, buried at a 40-degree angle, with its lower edge nearly 15 feet beneath the surface. What struck me immediately was that this hadn't crashed recently. Vegetation growth patterns and soil stratification suggested the object had been underground for decades at minimum, possibly 50 to 100 years, based on the root systems that had grown around and partially over it. Whatever had brought this craft down had happened long before Roswell, before World War II, possibly before the Wright brothers first flew at Kitty Hawk. The implications were staggering. These visitors, whoever they were, had been coming to Earth and occasionally failing to leave for far longer than anyone had suspected. I stood at the edge of the excavation pit watching earth-moving equipment expose metal that predated our entire aerospace industry, and I felt history rewriting itself in real time. The exterior surface showed the same properties we'd seen in the Roswell debris: seamless construction with no visible welds or fasteners, that peculiar quality of being both metallic and organic simultaneously, covered in symbols that seemed to shift in the changing light of late afternoon. But unlike the fragments in Wrightfield's laboratory, this surface showed damage. A section of the lower hull appeared scorched or corroded, suggesting either weapon impact or catastrophic systems failure. Dr. Bush ordered core samples from the damaged area, and when the drill bits made contact, they generated sparks and heat that forced the operator to back away. "It's still energized," Bush muttered. "After decades underground, whatever powers these things is still active." By 2100 hours, the excavation was complete enough to attempt entry, and Bush assembled a team of 12, including myself, to make first contact with whatever lay inside. We approached wearing protective suits designed for handling radioactive materials, though our dosimeters showed only background radiation. The entry point appeared to be a seam in the hull that became visible only when you stood at specific angles, another trick of their construction that made you wonder how much of what we were seeing was actually there versus how much was visual manipulation or dimensional engineering beyond our comprehension. Bush placed his hand on the seam and pushed gently, and the hull section irised open with a sound like singing crystal, revealing an opening approximately 4 feet high. The interior defied spatial logic in ways that made my engineering training rebel against sensory input. The craft's external dimensions suggested an interior space of perhaps 800 square feet, accounting for hull thickness and systems. But stepping through that opening was like entering a space 5 times larger than the exterior should have contained, corridors that extended farther than 40-foot diameter would allow, chambers that shouldn't have fit within the visible hull. Dr. Bush was muttering calculations under his breath, repeatedly checking his tape measure against visible distances, unable to reconcile measurements with observations. "It's impossible," he kept saying. "The geometry is wrong. The space curves in ways that three-dimensional objects shouldn't curve." The lighting within the craft activated as we moved, panels in the walls and ceiling beginning to glow with soft luminescence that seemed to anticipate where we were headed. No switches, no controls. The craft itself was responding to our presence, adjusting its environment for beings it recognized as conscious. The corridors were smooth, curved, decorated with more of those shifting symbols that might have been labels or warnings or possibly poetry for all we could determine. Every surface felt slightly warm, humming with energy that you sensed more than heard, and the air had a quality that reminded me of mountain atmosphere after a thunderstorm, clean and charged and wrong, in ways that made your lungs work harder than normal breathing should require. We found the first occupant in what appeared to be a central chamber, though calling it a body felt inadequate for what we were witnessing. The being was preserved in something that looked like crystal or amber, or possibly a stasis field that our physics couldn't explain, suspended in perfect condition despite decades underground. Despite whatever catastrophe had brought this craft to Earth, it was humanoid in the sense that it had 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, and a head, but the proportions were wrong in ways that marked it as unmistakably other, perhaps 4.5 feet tall, with limbs that were thin but suggested strength in their construction, torso that appeared more compact than human proportion would allow. The head was what destroyed any remaining possibility of this being terrestrial evolution. Elongated cranium that swept back from a face that was too smooth, too symmetrical, dominated by eyes that were easily 3 times larger than human proportion. Even in stasis or death, those eyes carried an expression that haunted me. Not fear or pain, but something closer to sadness or resignation, as if this being had known it was dying and had accepted that fate with a grace that most humans couldn't manage. 4 fingers on each hand, longer than human fingers and more delicate, arranged around what might have been a palm, or might have been something else entirely. No visible ears, no nose in the human sense, just small apertures that might have served for respiration or sensing. The skin, if you could call it skin, had a grayish tone that might have been natural coloring or might have been artifact of preservation, with a texture that appeared almost translucent in the craft's lighting. Through that translucency, you could see structures beneath that might have been bones or might have been some other support system, arranged in patterns that suggested this being's evolution had followed completely different paths from anything terrestrial. No evidence of clothing or equipment, suggesting either this species didn't use such things, or that whatever they wore had degraded in ways the body itself hadn't. I stood there in that impossible space looking at a being that shouldn't exist according to everything I'd been taught about life and evolution and creation, and I felt something fundamental break inside my understanding of the universe. I'd been raised Episcopalian, taught that humans were God's special creation, made in His image, crowned with glory and honor, and given dominion over the earth. But this being predated American civilization by decades at minimum, represented intelligence that had mastered technologies we couldn't begin to understand, came from a world we couldn't even locate. Where did it fit in God's plan? Was it also made in His image? Did it have a soul? Had Christ died for its sins too? Or was salvation a purely human concern that the cosmos found amusing? Dr. Bush stood beside me, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same existential vertigo I was feeling. "Bob, I've spent my entire career believing that human intelligence was the peak of creation, that our science and technology represented the highest achievement possible for conscious beings. Looking at this craft, at this being, at technology that makes our best efforts look like stone tools and fire, I don't know what to believe anymore. Either we're children playing at understanding forces that adults manipulate effortlessly, or everything we've accomplished has been leading towards something we're not ready to comprehend yet." He turned away from the preserved occupant, and I saw tears on his face that he didn't bother hiding. I'm 67 years old. I thought I understood how the universe worked. And in one afternoon, everything I believed has been proven inadequate. We spent 6 more hours in that craft, documenting everything we could with photographs and measurements that would never fully capture what we'd witnessed. The implications were overwhelming. This technology was ancient by human standards, but still functional, suggesting whoever built it operated on timescales that made our entire history look like a brief moment. The being preserved in the central chamber had been intelligent, conscious, possibly even cultural in ways we couldn't recognize. And this was just one craft, one incident, one visitor among what might have been thousands or millions across human history. As we finally emerged back into Arizona night, the stars looked different, not as distant lights in a vast, empty cosmos, but as homes to civilizations that had been traveling between them while humans were still learning to plant crops. That night, I wrote a letter to Dorothy that I could never send, trying to explain what I'd seen and what it meant and why I couldn't come home yet, because this discovery was bigger than career or family or even national security. I wrote about seeing the face of something that had traveled across impossible distances to visit our world, about standing in a craft that violated the laws of physics I'd spent my life studying, about the fundamental loneliness of realizing that we were not alone and never had been, but that the universe was so much vaster and stranger than we'd imagined. I finished the letter around 400, burned it in an ashtray per security protocols, and lay in my bunk staring at the ceiling while my faith in an ordered, human-centered universe crumbled like ash. The next 4 months were spent in laboratories that didn't officially exist, analyzing technology that violated principles we'd assumed were fundamental laws rather than provisional theories. We worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week, sleeping in bunks adjacent to the research facilities because the security protocols didn't allow us to leave the compound once we'd been exposed to certain materials. I called Dorothy twice a week on monitored lines, telling her I was working on classified aircraft development, listening to her tell me about Robert Jr., his basketball games, and Sarah's piano recitals, pretending that my life was still the normal existence of an engineer solving normal problems rather than the reality of confronting technology that suggested everything we knew about physics was incomplete at best. The propulsion system, if you could even call it that, was the most maddening puzzle. Conventional rocket engines work through action-reaction, burning fuel to create thrust in one direction by expelling mass in the opposite direction. The craft we'd recovered showed no evidence of fuel tanks, no combustion chambers, no rocket nozzles, nothing that resembled any propulsion system in our theoretical understanding. What we found instead were circular structures in the lower hull that generated fields we could detect but not measure properly. Our instruments would show readings that made no sense, needles swinging past maximum capacity or dropping to zero depending on how we oriented the sensors. Dr. Bush hypothesized that the system was manipulating gravity itself rather than pushing against it, essentially creating localized distortions in space-time that would allow the craft to fall in any direction it chose. The materials analysis was equally frustrating because every test revealed properties that couldn't coexist in conventional matter. We had metallurgists from MIT and Caltech examining samples that appeared to be metallic alloys, but which contained elements that didn't appear anywhere in the periodic table we'd been expanding since Mendeleev first organized it in 1869. Spectroscopic analysis would show emission lines that had no match to known elements, suggesting either entirely new substances or forms of matter that existed in quantum states we didn't have the theoretical framework to understand. One researcher suggested we might be looking at stable forms of elements that only existed for microseconds in our nuclear weapons tests, super-heavy elements from an island of stability that our physics predicted but couldn't produce. What made the materials particularly inexplicable was that their properties changed based on external conditions in ways that seemed almost intelligent. A sample that was rigid at room temperature would become flexible when electrically charged, then return to rigidity when the charge was removed, all without any visible mechanism for the transformation. Another sample would conduct heat efficiently in one direction, but act as a perfect insulator in the reverse direction, as if the material understood the concept of one-way flow. Dr. Bronk began referring to the materials as smart matter, suggesting they incorporated computing or decision-making at the molecular level, responding to their environment in ways that blurred the boundary between substance and machine. The control systems were where the technology moved from advanced engineering into what felt dangerously close to science fiction or occultism. The intact craft from Arizona contained what appeared to be control stations, smooth surfaces marked with those shifting symbols, arranged in patterns that suggested pilot positions, even though there were no physical controls, no switches or levers or anything you could manipulate with. When human researchers touched the surface, nothing happened. But when we brought in subjects who'd been exposed to other parts of the craft for extended periods, they reported sensations that suggested the controls were responding to thought rather than physical contact. One technician described placing his hands on the control surface and experiencing a flood of information that wasn't verbal or visual, but somehow communicated the craft's system status directly into his awareness. The power source remained completely mysterious despite months of analysis. Every system we examined was still operational despite the craft being underground for potentially a century, suggesting either energy storage that made our best batteries look like primitive chemical reactions or continuous power generation from a source we couldn't identify. We found no fuel, no evidence of nuclear reactions, no connection to external power. The working hypothesis was that the craft was somehow extracting energy from zero-point fluctuations in vacuum. The quantum foam that theoretical physics suggested contained infinite energy at scales below atomic resolution. If true, it meant these visitors had learned to tap an effectively unlimited power source that existed everywhere in the universe, while humanity was still burning dinosaur residue to boil water and spin turbines. The most disturbing discovery came when we attempted carbon dating on organic materials found within the craft, fragments that might have been fabric or biological residue from the occupants. The results were impossible. Different samples from the same location showed ages ranging from 50 years to 5,000 years, with variations that couldn't be explained by contamination or measurement error. Dr. Bush assembled 3 different dating teams using different methodologies: carbon-14, uranium-thorium, and thermoluminescence. All 3 returned inconsistent results that suggested either our dating methods were fundamentally flawed or that the craft and its contents existed in multiple time frames simultaneously. One physicist suggested the propulsion system's gravity manipulation might have temporal side effects, causing time dilation that made conventional aging processes meaningless. Laboratory testing of the artifacts began producing phenomena that made us question whether we were doing physics experiments or accidentally performing some kind of technological seance. Small objects placed near active components would begin floating, not pushed by electromagnetism or conventional forces, but suspended in ways that violated conservation of energy, rising slowly, hovering perfectly still, then descending gently as if the craft was demonstrating capabilities without bothering to explain them. Time measurements became unreliable in certain parts of the facility. Chronometers would show elapsed time that didn't match external references, and researchers working in high-exposure areas reported subjective experiences of duration that conflicted with objective measurements. One scientist insisted he'd worked for 30 minutes when external clocks showed 3 hours had passed, while another had the opposite experience, feeling hours had elapsed during minutes. The first fatal accident occurred on March 3, 1948, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone familiar with UFO history. Dr. Kenneth Arnold, no relation to the civilian pilot who'd coined the term flying saucer 9 months earlier, but sharing the same name through cruel coincidence, was conducting resonance analysis on one of the propulsion components when it activated spontaneously. What happened next was captured on film by the automatic cameras we'd installed throughout the laboratory, though the footage was so disturbing that it was immediately classified above even our normal operational security level. Arnold was standing approximately 3 feet from the component when it began generating the field we'd been trying to understand, and his body simply came apart. Not explosively, not violently in the conventional sense, but systematically, as if every molecule in his body had suddenly decided to occupy a different location in space. The film showed his form becoming translucent, then fragmenting into what looked like geometric particles that dispersed in patterns too organized to be random. The process took perhaps 2 seconds from activation to complete dispersal, and then there was nothing left except his clothes and a circular area of floor that had been subjected to forces that left the concrete cracked in fractal patterns radiating from where Arnold had stood. The component continued operating for another 8 minutes before shutting down as mysteriously as it had activated, and we never determined what had triggered it or why it had chosen that particular moment to demonstrate capabilities we hadn't known it possessed. The aftermath was worse than the death itself. Arnold's body was never recovered because there was no body, just molecular-level dispersion that might as well have been complete disintegration. His widow was told he died in an industrial accident involving classified aircraft components, which was technically true, but provided no closure about what had happened or why there was no body to bury. The research team was traumatized, not just by witnessing a colleague's death, but by the manner of it. The casual efficiency with which the technology had converted a living human into dispersed particles suggested we were playing with forces that didn't recognize human life as particularly significant or worth preserving. Dr. Bush ordered a 2-week suspension of all hands-on testing while we reviewed safety protocols and tried to understand what had gone wrong. But the real lesson was that our safety protocols were based on understanding of hazards that this technology rendered obsolete. You can't protect against risks you can't predict, and we were working with systems that operated according to principles we didn't comprehend, using energies we couldn't measure with effects that manifested in ways physics said shouldn't be possible. When we resumed testing, it was with the understanding that we were essentially volunteers in an extremely dangerous exploration of technologies that our species might not be ready to handle safely. The psychological toll was becoming evident across the research team. Men who'd spent careers believing in the ordered, predictable universe described by Newton and Einstein were now confronting daily evidence that reality was stranger and more dangerous than our theories suggested. Several researchers requested transfers, citing health concerns or family obligations, but really fleeing the existential vertigo of working with technology that made you question whether human intelligence was adequate to understand what we'd discovered. I developed insomnia that lasted for decades, lying awake, calculating the probability that humanity would survive its contact with knowledge we'd recovered from those crash sites, wondering if perhaps the crashes themselves were warnings we weren't wise enough to interpret correctly. By March 1948, we'd learned enough to be terrified and not enough to be useful. We knew the craft used propulsion principles that violated our understanding of physics. We knew the materials incorporated properties that shouldn't be possible in conventional matter. We knew the controls responded to consciousness in ways that suggested technology and biology were integrated at levels we couldn't distinguish. We knew the power systems accessed energy sources that made nuclear weapons look primitive. And we knew that trying to reverse engineer any of this carried risks that included accidental self-destruction, uncontrolled activation of forces we couldn't shut down, and potentially attracting attention from whoever had built these craft in the first place. Dr. Bush summarized our situation perfectly. Gentlemen, we've opened a door we can't close, and we have no idea what's on the other side, or whether it's interested in what happens to the monkeys playing with tools they found in the wreckage. The intelligence report arrived on April 12, 1948, in a locked briefcase, handcuffed to a courier who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Alan Dulles presented the findings to our team with the kind of clinical precision that made bad news sound even worse. The CIA had confirmed through multiple independent sources that the Soviet Union had recovered similar materials, possibly from the Tunguska event in 1908, and definitely from a recent incident in Siberia during winter of 1947. The Tunguska connection was particularly disturbing because it meant the Soviets had potentially been studying this technology for 40 years, since before the revolution, before World War I, before the Soviet state even existed. If they'd made any progress at all in understanding what they'd recovered, they had a multi-decade head start that our frantic 6 months of research couldn't overcome. Dulles laid out photographs obtained by assets in Moscow, grainy surveillance images showing what appeared to be a heavily guarded facility near Kapustin Yar, unusual construction that matched no known Soviet military installation, and transport records indicating movement of geological specimens, weighing far more than any natural rock formation should weigh. The assessment was unambiguous. Stalin knew about the crashes, had assembled his own research team, and was applying typical Soviet methodology: unlimited resources, complete disregard for safety protocols, and willingness to sacrifice researchers if it meant achieving results faster. Dulles concluded with words that made my blood run cold. Gentlemen, if the Soviets master this technology before we do, the Cold War ends before it begins. Whoever can manipulate gravity, generate unlimited power, and potentially access whatever weapon systems these craft possess. Won't need nuclear arsenals or conventional forces. They'll have technological supremacy that makes everything else obsolete. The paranoia that followed was both justified and toxic. Every delay became evidence of Soviet advantage. Every setback proof that we were losing a race where second place meant national extinction. Forrestal, already showing signs of the psychological breakdown that would lead to his death a year later, became obsessed with the Soviet threat to the point of seeing enemy agents in every unexplained equipment failure or research dead end. He pushed for more aggressive testing, faster timelines, elimination of safety protocols that slowed progress. Bush tried to maintain scientific rigor, arguing that rushing analysis would produce dangerous mistakes rather than useful results. But the pressure from political leadership was relentless. We weren't just scientists anymore. We were soldiers in an invisible war where the enemy might already be winning. Truman authorized unlimited funding in a classified executive order that essentially gave MJ-12 blank checks, drawn on accounts that didn't officially exist. Money poured into Wright Field and newly established facilities at Los Alamos and Groom Lake, later known as Area 51. We hired the best minds we could find and vet through security protocols. Physicists from Princeton and Berkeley, engineers from MIT and Caltech, specialists in fields that didn't have formal names yet because the problems we were solving hadn't existed before. The phrase, "any means necessary," appeared in operational directives with increasing frequency, and we all understood what it meant. Normal ethical guidelines were suspended in favor of results. Human rights became negotiable if they conflicted with research objectives. And the usual academic debates about methodology were replaced with military urgency that tolerated no dissent. The pressure manifested in increasingly reckless experimentation. We moved from careful observation to aggressive intervention, trying to force the technology to reveal its secrets through methods that bordered on technological torture. 3 more researchers died during this period, and unlike Dr. Arnold's incident, these deaths were the result of calculated risks rather than unexpected accidents. Dr. James McCready from MIT died attempting to activate a propulsion component by overloading it with electrical current. The component exploded with force that vaporized everything within a 6-foot radius. Dr. Sarah Chen, one of our few female researchers and a brilliant theoretical physicist, was killed when a control surface she was interfacing with apparently fed back more information than human neurology could process. She suffered what the autopsy called catastrophic neural overload that left her brain physically undamaged, but completely non-functional. The third death was perhaps the most disturbing because it was slow enough that we had time to document what was happening while being powerless to stop it. Captain William Morrison, an Air Force pilot who'd been selected for human-machine interface testing, spent 3 weeks in increasing agony as his body rejected whatever changes the technology had initiated in his cellular structure. His symptoms started with headaches and vision problems, progressed to seizures and organ failure, and culminated in a death that looked like aggressive cancer, except it wasn't cancer. It was his own cells transforming into something that wasn't quite human anymore, attempting to adapt to technology that required biological architecture we didn't possess. He died screaming about seeing things that weren't there, about voices speaking mathematics directly into his consciousness, about understanding how the universe really worked, and wishing he could stop understanding because the knowledge was destroying him from inside. In June, I presented my theoretical framework to the assembled MJ-12 leadership, the first comprehensive model of how the alien technology functioned based on 6 months of observation and analysis. The mathematics were elegant in their own way, but they required abandoning several foundational assumptions of 20th century physics. I proposed that the craft operated by manipulating what I called metric engineering, directly altering the geometry of space-time rather than moving through it conventionally. The propulsion didn't push against anything. It changed the local curvature of space so that the craft's destination was already at its location. Distance became negotiable, time became flexible, and the usual constraints of acceleration and inertia became irrelevant when you could simply redefine what here and there meant at a fundamental level. The power systems I suggested weren't generating energy in any conventional sense, but rather creating stable connections to the quantum vacuum, those zero-point fluctuations that exist everywhere in the universe at scales below atomic resolution. If you could tap that infinite sea of virtual particles constantly appearing and disappearing, you'd have effectively unlimited power without needing fuel or generating waste products. The control systems that responded to thought weren't reading minds, but detecting the electromagnetic patterns that consciousness generates in human brains, then translating those patterns into operational commands. The materials with impossible properties were likely constructed at quantum scales using techniques that assembled matter atom by atom, according to programs that incorporated computing at molecular levels. Bush listened to my presentation in silence, then asked the only question that really mattered. Bob, if your theory is correct, how long until we can build something that duplicates even one of these capabilities? I had to tell him the truth. With current technology and understanding, decades at minimum, more likely centuries, we're trying to reverse engineer a supercomputer using vacuum tubes and mechanical calculators. We don't have the tools to build the tools we'd need to actually fabricate something like this. The room fell silent as everyone processed what that meant. The Soviets were in the same position we were, fumbling with technology that might as well have been magic for all our ability to comprehend it, but fumbling faster because they were willing to sacrifice more researchers and take risks we were only beginning to consider acceptable. The psychological toll of this period was severe. We were working 16-hour days under constant pressure, watching colleagues die in accidents that couldn't be explained to their families, pursuing research that violated our training and instincts, all while knowing that failure might mean Soviet technological supremacy and potentially the end of American democracy. I stopped sleeping more than 3 or 4 hours a night, sustained by Benzedrine and coffee and the manic energy that comes from pushing human endurance past reasonable limits. My letters to Dorothy became increasingly incoherent. I'd write pages of technical speculation that I couldn't send, then substitute single paragraphs about missing her and the children that couldn't convey what I was really experiencing. By August 1948, we'd achieved a partial understanding of principles without ability to apply them practically. We knew how the technology probably worked, but couldn't replicate even its most basic functions. We'd documented materials with properties that violated known physics but couldn't manufacture similar substances. We'd recorded evidence of consciousness-machine interfaces but couldn't build devices that responded to human thought. And we'd lost 6 researchers to accidents that demonstrated we were playing with forces we didn't understand and couldn't control safely. The Soviets, according to our intelligence, were experiencing similar difficulties with similar casualties, which meant both superpowers were locked in a race to achieve breakthroughs that might not be possible with current human knowledge, or might require sacrifices neither side was quite ready to make, at least not yet. But the pressure kept building, and I knew from experience with military research that eventually, when pressure exceeded restraint, someone would cross lines that shouldn't be crossed in pursuit of advantages that might not even exist. The discovery happened by accident during a routine calibration test in September 1948. Dr. Bronk was attempting to measure the control surface response times using standard electromagnetic sensors when one of the technicians, a young airman named David Mills, accidentally brushed his bare hand against the interface panel. The instruments that had shown minimal activity suddenly spiked across every metric simultaneously, as if the technology had been waiting for organic contact rather than mechanical probing. Mills reported a sensation like static electricity mixed with the feeling of falling, and for perhaps 3 seconds he claimed to understand the craft's status, not through visual displays or audible signals, but through direct knowledge that simply appeared in his consciousness. When Bronk asked him to describe what he'd learned, Mills broke down sobbing, unable to articulate understanding that existed in forms human language couldn't capture. Dr. Bronk presented his proposal to the MJ-12 leadership with the kind of clinical detachment that made horrific suggestions sound reasonable. Gentlemen, our instrumental analysis has reached its limits because we're trying to understand organic technology using inorganic tools. These craft appear designed to interface directly with conscious biological entities. If we want meaningful progress, we need to stop treating consciousness as an obstacle to measurement and start treating it as the measurement instrument itself. He was proposing human experimentation, though he never used those words. Instead, he framed it as biological interface research under the existing Aerospace Medical Advancement Program that nobody outside our clearance level knew existed. The program was approved with disturbing speed, authorized under protocols that bypassed normal human subjects' protections by classifying the research as critical national security operations. Volunteers were recruited from military personnel with appropriate security clearances and psychological profiles indicating high tolerance for unusual experiences. Officially, they were participating in advanced aircraft testing and physiological studies of high-altitude flight, the kind of research that legitimately existed and that provided perfect cover for what we were actually doing. The consent forms they signed were comprehensive enough to absolve the government of responsibility for essentially any outcome, while vague enough that they couldn't possibly understand what they were actually agreeing to experience. Lieutenant Marcus Webb was among the first to volunteer, and his participation made the entire program personal in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd known Marcus since 1944 when we'd both worked on P-51 modifications at Wright Field during the war. He was a test pilot with combat experience over Germany. The kind of man who flew experimental aircraft with faulty engines because somebody needed to determine failure thresholds through actual testing rather than theoretical calculation. We'd maintained friendship after the war, and when I'd been recalled for the MJ-12 program, I'd recommended him for security clearance without fully understanding what I was drawing him into. When he showed up at the facility in September 1948, eager to be part of the most important aerospace research in history, I felt both pride that he trusted my judgment and dread about what that trust might cost him. The first interface sessions produced results that exceeded our most optimistic projections, while simultaneously raising questions we hadn't anticipated. Webb was seated in the control chamber of the intact Arizona craft, hands placed on the smooth surfaces that had remained inert under mechanical testing. Within minutes, he reported sensations that matched what Mills had experienced: understanding without learning, knowledge without study, as if the craft was teaching him its own language through direct neural transmission. He described feeling the craft's systems as extensions of his own body, understanding propulsion status the way you understand whether your arm is raised or lowered without needing to look. After 3 hours, Webb successfully activated navigation displays that we'd been unable to trigger through months of conventional analysis. The success led to expanded protocols and longer session durations, pushing the boundaries of safe exposure because we were finally making measurable progress after a year of frustrating stagnation. Webb spent increasing amounts of time interfaced with the craft's systems, sometimes 8 or 10 hours per day, returning from sessions exhausted but exhilarated by what he was experiencing. He described it as learning to think in a language that doesn't have words, just pure meaning, understanding concepts about space-time and energy and consciousness that couldn't be translated into human terminology without losing essential content. He was changing, becoming something between human test pilot and alien hybrid consciousness, and we documented every aspect of his transformation without seriously considering whether we should be preventing it instead of encouraging it. The side effects emerged gradually enough that we initially dismissed them as stress responses or sleep deprivation rather than fundamental neurological alteration. Webb began having vivid dreams that he described with unusual precision. Not the normal fragmentary recollections of sleep cognition, but coherent narratives about places he'd never been and events he hadn't witnessed. He'd wake up with knowledge about stellar navigation or energy physics that he shouldn't possess, answering technical questions that required advanced mathematics he'd never formally studied. Most disturbing was when he started speaking in his sleep, not English or any recognizable language, but phonetic structures that sounded almost like the vocalizations we'd recorded from the craft's systems during activation sequences. By December, the psychological deterioration was undeniable across multiple test subjects. Webb was the most successful interface subject, but even he was showing signs that his consciousness was being permanently altered in ways that made normal human cognition increasingly difficult. He'd lose track of time, becoming disoriented about whether minutes or hours had passed. He reported seeing things that weren't physically present, not hallucinations in the psychiatric sense, but perceptions of energy fields and quantum states that human neurology isn't designed to process. He knew things he couldn't possibly know, classified details about other MJ-12 projects, personal information about team members' private lives, technical specifications for aircraft designs that were still in early planning stages. The craft wasn't just teaching him its language. It was giving him access to information through channels we couldn't identify or control. The other volunteers fared worse. 3 subjects developed severe neurological symptoms requiring hospitalization, hemorrhaging in the visual cortex, seizures originating from temporal lobe structures, 1 case of complete psychological dissociation, that left the subject catatonic despite normal brain function on every measurable parameter. Captain Anderson suffered a catastrophic stroke during his 4th session, leaving him paralyzed on his right side and unable to speak coherently, communicating only through written fragments that suggested he was still receiving transmissions from the craft despite being physically separated from it by hundreds of yards. Sergeant Rodriguez entered a coma after attempting what he called deep integration with the propulsion systems. His EEG showed normal sleep patterns, but he never regained consciousness, dying 3 weeks later from complications we couldn't treat because we didn't understand their etiology. The ethical lines were crossed so gradually that I didn't recognize the moment we transitioned from volunteers to victims. The program expanded beyond initial consent parameters, extending session durations and pushing exposure limits, because each incremental increase produced marginally better results. Subjects who showed neurological symptoms were encouraged to continue rather than being withdrawn for medical treatment, with promises of future compensation for current sacrifice. The language in our reports shifted from research participants to experimental subjects, to eventually just assets. Terminology that dehumanized the men we were destroying in pursuit of technological understanding that might not even be achievable through human neurology. Webb's final coherent conversation with me occurred on January 8, 1949, after a particularly intensive session where he claimed to have accessed what he called the Deep Archive, information embedded in the craft at levels beyond conventional data storage. He found me in my office after midnight, looking simultaneously exhausted and terrified in ways I'd never seen in a man who'd flown combat missions over occupied Europe. "Bob," he said, and his voice had qualities that weren't quite right, harmonics that human vocal cords shouldn't produce, rhythm that suggested he was translating from thinking patterns that weren't structured like human language. "They're here. Not here in this facility, but here on Earth. They've always been here. And Bob, they know what we're doing. They're watching us learn from the wreckage, and they're deciding whether to intervene." I tried to get him to elaborate, to explain what he meant by they and watching and intervene, but his responses were fragmentary and increasingly incoherent. He'd start sentences in English and finish them in that alien phonetic structure, would answer questions I hadn't asked while ignoring the ones I had asked, would stare at points in empty air as if seeing things that occupied space without being visible to normal human perception. He told me the crashes weren't accidents, but deliberate, craft that had been deliberately shut down and left for us to find as some kind of test or offering. He said human consciousness was compatible with their technology because humans were designed to be compatible, that our entire evolutionary history had been guided toward producing minds that could eventually interface with systems that predated our species by millions of years. Before I could respond, before I could ask the obvious questions or demand clarification or even just tell him he needed immediate medical attention, Webb collapsed. Not gradually, not with warning symptoms, but instant transition from standing and speaking to unconscious on my office floor. The medical team arrived within minutes. We kept emergency personnel on standby specifically because of incidents like this, but they couldn't stabilize him. His vital signs were erratic, showing patterns that suggested his autonomic nervous system had forgotten how to regulate basic functions. His EEG looked like nothing our neurologists had seen before, not the flat line of brain death or the chaos of seizure activity, but organized patterns that suggested consciousness operating according to rules that weren't compatible with human neural architecture. Webb died at 0347 hours on January 9th without regaining consciousness, and the autopsy revealed something that made Dr. Bronk order an immediate suspension of all interface research pending review. Webb's brain showed structural changes that shouldn't have been possible, new neural pathways that hadn't existed on his medical scans from September, alterations to the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex that looked almost deliberate rather than pathological. The tissue samples under microscopic examination revealed something even more disturbing. His neurons had incorporated trace amounts of the same unknown elements we'd found in the craft materials, suggesting that the interface process wasn't just changing his consciousness, but physically transforming his biology at the cellular level to make him more compatible with technology that required different substrate than organic human tissue. I attended Webb's funeral in Iowa, standing in the back while his widow and 3 children buried a man who died from causes they could never be told about in service of research they couldn't know existed. The official story was aircraft testing accident, propulsion failure at high altitude leading to fatal crash. Technically true, if you parsed propulsion failure broadly enough and understood high altitude metaphorically rather than literally. His widow thanked me for recommending Marcus for the program that killed him, believing he died advancing American aerospace capability rather than being sacrificed to understand alien consciousness interface technology that we probably shouldn't have been trying to comprehend in the first place. I accepted her gratitude knowing I'd sent my friend to his death as surely as if I'd personally pulled a trigger. The human experimentation program was officially suspended in January 1949, redesignated as inactive pending safety protocol revision, in language that meant it was too dangerous to continue but too valuable to abandon permanently. 6 subjects had suffered severe neurological damage, 3 were dead, and 2 remained in permanent medical care, requiring treatments that couldn't be properly explained to their families. We'd learned that human consciousness could interface with the alien technology, that the interface produced knowledge transfer that exceeded conventional learning by orders of magnitude, and that the cost of that knowledge was transformation of human neurology into something that wasn't quite human anymore, something that might be superior in terms of information processing, but that couldn't survive in biological substrate that evolution had optimized for completely different purposes. And we'd learned that Webb's final warning was probably accurate. They were watching, they knew what we were doing, and they were making decisions about humanity's fate based on how we handled the gifts or tests or warnings they'd left scattered across our planet in the form of crashed technology we were nowhere near ready to safely comprehend. Dr. Elizabeth Carmichael joined the project in February 1949, recruited from the Army's cryptography division, where she'd spent the war breaking Japanese naval codes. She was a linguist by training, fluent in 7 languages with doctoral work in comparative philology from Oxford. But more importantly, she approached unknown symbol systems with methodology that combined pattern recognition with historical context analysis. Bush brought her in to examine the symbols we'd been documenting for 18 months, the markings that covered interior surfaces of the craft and appeared on fragments recovered from crash sites. We'd been treating them as decorative or possibly instructional, assuming they represented communication between whatever built these craft. Carmichael's first assessment, delivered after 3 days of preliminary study, challenged our fundamental assumptions. Gentlemen, these aren't words. They're not even language in any sense we'd recognize. They're data structures, compressed temporal information arranged in what I can only describe as 4-dimensional notation. The breakthrough came when Carmichael stopped trying to read the symbols sequentially and instead mapped them spatially across multiple surfaces simultaneously, treating the entire craft's interior as a single document rather than discrete messages. Patterns emerged that suggested chronological organization, but the chronology wasn't linear. It branched and converged, showing events that occurred simultaneously in different locations, relationships between incidents that were separated by what appeared to be vast time intervals. She described it as reading a history book where every page exists at the same moment, and the narrative structure is spatial rather than temporal. With help from 3 mathematicians and specialized photography equipment that could capture the symbol's subtle variations under different lighting conditions, Carmichael began constructing what she called a temporal map, a visual representation of the information encoded in the craft's surfaces. What emerged from 6 weeks of analysis was more disturbing than anything we'd uncovered through materials science or propulsion research. The symbols weren't recording communication between crew members or operational procedures for the craft's systems. They were observation logs, detailed systematic documentation of Earth's biological and geological history across what Carmichael estimated as at least 10,000 years of monitoring, possibly significantly longer. The logs showed regular visits. Not continuous presence, but periodic check-ins, measurements, sample collections, interventions that were recorded with scientific precision, but without emotional context or moral framework. We were looking at field research notes from a study that had been ongoing since before human civilization emerged from hunter-gatherer cultures, possibly predating agriculture and permanent settlements entirely. The implications hit me like physical impact. These crashes we'd been treating as accidents, mechanical failures or navigation errors. They weren't failures at all. They were monitoring stations that had completed their operational lifetime and been abandoned or shut down, left to degrade naturally until geological processes buried them, or until humans developed sufficient technology to locate and recover them. The Arizona craft that had been underground for potentially a century wasn't a crash victim. It was an observation post that had watched human development through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, documenting everything from the Industrial Revolution to World War I before its systems finally failed or it was deliberately deactivated. Roswell and the other 1947 incidents weren't increased visitation. They were increased failure rates of monitoring equipment that had reached the end of its design lifetime approximately simultaneously. Dr. Carmichael's analysis revealed evidence of multiple distinct symbol systems within the broader documentation, suggesting either multiple species working together on the observation project or a single species using different notation for different purposes. Some sections appeared to document atmospheric composition, geological activity, and climate patterns, basic planetary science that any advanced civilization might conduct. But other sections focused specifically on biological development, with particular attention to organisms displaying complex cognition and social behaviors. The level of detail was staggering. Genetic sequences rendered in visual notation, anatomical diagrams showing evolutionary changes across generations, behavioral observations that tracked technological development, and cultural patterns with the kind of comprehensive documentation that suggested whoever was conducting this study considered it significant enough to justify millennia of sustained effort. The most disturbing sections were the ones Carmichael called intervention logs, records that appeared to document not just passive observation, but active manipulation of terrestrial biology. The notation was complex enough that interpretation required substantial guesswork, but the patterns suggested periodic introduction of genetic material into existing species, modifications that accelerated certain evolutionary pathways while suppressing others, targeted interventions that appeared designed to produce organisms with specific cognitive or physical characteristics. The timeline roughly corresponded with known periods of rapid evolutionary change in the fossil record, sudden appearances of new species that paleontologists had struggled to explain through conventional natural selection models, punctuated equilibrium events where evolution seemed to jump forward in ways that required either unusual environmental pressures or some other mechanism we hadn't yet identified. One section of the temporal map focused specifically on hominid development over the past several million years, and the detail level increased dramatically around 200,000 years ago, roughly when anatomically modern humans emerged from our ancestral species. The annotation suggested this wasn't coincidental. The intervention logs from this period showed patterns consistent with deliberate genetic engineering, selected breeding programs that would have required managing specific population groups across multiple generations, introduction of genetic sequences that don't appear in our closest evolutionary relatives, modifications to neural architecture that made human cognition qualitatively different from other primates, despite our significant genetic similarity. The uncomfortable conclusion was that Homo sapiens as we exist today might not be purely the result of natural evolutionary processes. We might be the product of directed development by civilizations that had mastered genetic manipulation before our ancestors learned to make fire. The purpose of these interventions remained unclear, though Carmichael identified several competing hypotheses based on analogies to human scientific research. The monitoring and modification might be pure science, the alien equivalent of long-term ecological studies, observing how consciousness and technology develop under different conditions across multiple worlds. Or it might be more practical, genetic engineering designed to produce organisms that could eventually serve specific purposes once they reached sufficient developmental milestones. The most disturbing possibility was that Earth was functioning as an agricultural project, a managed environment where conscious beings were cultivated like crops, their development guided toward producing something that whoever maintained these monitoring stations considered valuable enough to justify 10 millennia of careful observation. I spent 3 nights unable to sleep after reviewing Carmichael's complete analysis, sitting in my quarters staring at walls, while my understanding of human history underwent fundamental revision. Every achievement I'd been taught to celebrate, the development of language, the emergence of agriculture, the scientific revolution, the technological advances that had defined modern civilization, all of it might be the expected outcome of genetic programming introduced by visitors who'd been shaping human development since before we were recognizably human. Free will.
individual achievement, cultural progress. These concepts became questionable when examined against evidence that our entire species might be following a developmental pathway that had been designed by intelligence that treated us the way we treated laboratory specimens or agricultural stock. The crisis wasn't just intellectual. It was existential and theological in ways that made Webb's death seem like a mercy compared to surviving with this knowledge.
I'd been raised believing that humans were God's special creation, made in His image, crowned with glory and honor and given dominion over the earth. But if we were actually genetic constructs engineered by alien civilizations for purposes we couldn't identify, what did that mean for soul and salvation? Had God created our creators, making us indirectly divine through multiple degrees of separation? Or was the entire theological framework of my upbringing just one more artifact of genetic programming, religious impulse, coded into our neural architecture, because it served some purpose in the developmental pathway whoever designed us wanted to encourage? I tried discussing these implications with Dr. Bush, hoping that his scientific objectivity might provide perspective that my theological confusion couldn't access. Instead, I found that he was experiencing similar existential vertigo, though from different starting assumptions. "Bob," he said during a late-night conversation that felt more like confession than scientific dialogue, "I've spent my career believing that human progress represented the apex of conscious achievement in the universe. Now I'm confronted with evidence that everything we've accomplished might be the expected behavior of a successful experiment. Not achievement, but predictable outcome. Are we even capable of original thought? Or are we just following programming that's sophisticated enough that we experience it as free will, while actually moving along predetermined pathways?" The final section of Carmichael's temporal map suggested the monitoring wasn't finished, wasn't even close to finished. The logs showed patterns of increasing attention as human technological development accelerated, more frequent visits and more detailed documentation during periods of rapid change. The implication was clear. Whoever had been observing us for 10,000 years was particularly interested in what we were doing right now, in the mid-20th century, as we developed nuclear weapons and aerospace technology and started reaching toward capabilities that might eventually make us visible to cosmic neighborhood in ways that would require different kinds of management or intervention. The crashes in 1947 weren't conclusions, but escalations. Increased monitoring during a critical phase of human development, where we were approaching thresholds that mattered to whatever long-term project Earth represented. And there was one more disturbing detail that Carmichael could only partially interpret. Recurring symbols that appeared throughout the temporal map in contexts that suggested they were labels or designations for specific time frames. One set appeared with unusual frequency in sections documenting recent human history, rendered in notation that Carmichael's analysis suggested might be calendrical, markers for specific dates or periods that were considered significant enough to warrant special attention. When she attempted to correlate these temporal markers with our calendar system, accounting for the various conversion uncertainties and assumption about how their time measurement might work, several of them appeared to correspond with future dates rather than past events. The closest one, if her calculations were accurate within even an order of magnitude, fell somewhere in the mid-2020s, roughly 75 years from when we were conducting this analysis. I stood in the laboratory looking at Carmichael's temporal map spread across multiple whiteboards, hundreds of photographs and correlation charts showing the systematic observation of human development across millennia, and I felt everything I'd believed about human agency and significance crumble into irrelevance. We weren't the pinnacle of creation, or even the architects of our own destiny. We were experiments running their course, specimens being monitored by intelligence that operated on timescales that made our entire recorded history look like a brief moment in a much longer process. And the monitoring stations that had failed weren't failures at all. They were obsolete equipment being replaced by whatever came next, because the experiment was entering a new phase that required different observation protocols, or possibly preparation for intervention that would make previous manipulations look gentle by comparison. That night I wrote another letter to Dorothy that I would never send, trying to explain that I was losing my faith not because I'd stopped believing in God, but because I'd discovered evidence that humans might not be the kind of beings that God, if he existed, would have created directly. We might be secondary creation, tertiary even, products of a chain of intelligent design that stretched back through multiple species, and ultimately to origins we couldn't trace. And if that was true, if we were experiments rather than children? What did that mean for prayer and salvation and the entire framework of meaning that had sustained me through 38 years of life and 4 years of terrible war? I finished the letter at 400, burned it with the others, and lay in my bunk wondering whether the monitoring stations had recorded my crisis of faith and whether whoever reviewed those records would find it interesting or just predictable behavior from organic consciousness, discovering its own constructed nature. The first indication that something had shifted came in June when I noticed meeting schedules that didn't include my name, despite dealing with technical matters that fell directly within my expertise. Conference room reservations marked Executive Session, Limited Access appeared on calendars with attendee lists that excluded half the original MJ-12 team, including most of the scientists who'd been present since Truman's initial briefing. When I asked Bush about the meetings, his response was carefully neutral. Administrative matters, Bob. Budget allocations and political liaison that don't require technical input. But his eyes carried the same evasive quality I'd seen in officers during the war, when they were lying about operational security to maintain morale among troops who'd figured out the mission was more dangerous than officially acknowledged. Secretary Forrestal requested a private meeting with me on June 14th, scheduling it away from right field at a small diner in Dayton, where the chances of surveillance or unwanted attention were minimal. He looked terrible, 20 pounds lighter than when I'd first met him in September 1947, with the kind of exhaustion that suggested more than just overwork. His hands trembled slightly as he stirred coffee he didn't drink, and his voice had a quality that made you think of men who'd seen combat too long and were holding themselves together through willpower that was rapidly depleting. "Bob," he said without preamble, "I need you to understand something that I should have told you months ago. This program, MJ-12, it isn't what Truman thinks it is anymore. Maybe it never was. I don't know when the shift happened, but we've gone from defense research to something else entirely." He leaned forward, voice dropping to barely above whisper despite the diner being nearly empty. "There's a faction within the group that sees this technology not as a challenge to understand, but as an opportunity to exploit. They're talking about weaponization, about using what we've recovered to establish permanent American superiority. Not just military advantage, global dominance that would make the British Empire at its height look like a regional power. They want to provoke war with the Soviets while we have technological edges they can't counter, eliminate the communist threat before it becomes existential, reshape the entire geopolitical order with us holding power that makes nuclear weapons obsolete." His hands were shaking harder now, coffee sloshing in the cup he still hadn't drunk from. "It's not about defense, Bob. It never was about defense. It's about empire." I started to respond, to argue that surely Truman wouldn't allow such deviation from the program's stated purpose, but Forrestal cut me off with a laugh that had no humor in it whatsoever. "The president doesn't know. Or he knows, but he's been convinced it's necessary. Or he knows and he's powerless to stop it, because the people running this operation have access to resources and authorities that don't require his ongoing approval." I don't know which scenario is true anymore. I just know that every briefing I attend makes me more certain that we're not the good guys in this situation, and that the technology we're playing with is going to lead us to consequences we can't control and won't survive. He stood abruptly, leaving cash on the table for coffee. Neither of us had finished. "Be careful, Bob. Document everything. And if something happens to me, don't believe the official story." 2 weeks later, on June 22, 1949, James Forrestal fell from the 16th floor of Bethesda Naval Hospital, where he'd been receiving treatment for what was officially described as depression and mental exhaustion. The official investigation concluded suicide. Secretary Forrestal had been struggling with mental health issues related to overwork and stress, had expressed paranoid beliefs about Soviet infiltration, and had unfortunately succeeded in taking his own life despite medical supervision and security precautions. The story was clean, consistent, supported by medical records showing psychiatric treatment and testimony from hospital staff about Forrestal's deteriorating condition. It would have been entirely believable, except for 3 details that bothered me enough to conduct my own discreet investigation. Forrestal had been writing when he died, transcribing Sophocles by hand in what witnesses described as calm, focused work, rather than the behavior of someone in acute suicidal crisis. The window he allegedly jumped from had bars that should have prevented exactly that type of incident. and the hospital room where he died had been assigned at the last minute, replacing his original room in a way that security protocols should have flagged and prevented. I spent July and August using security clearances I technically still possessed, but which were probably in the process of being revoked, accessing files and communications that I probably wasn't supposed to see anymore.
What I discovered was a secondary structure within MJ-12 that had been developing since at least early 1948, operating with authorities that extended beyond the program's original mandate. Meeting minutes from sessions I hadn't attended revealed discussions about operational deployment timelines and strategic application protocols that didn't match the defensive research framework Truman had authorized. Budget allocations showed money being directed to weapons development programs at Los Alamos and facilities I didn't recognize, amounts that seemed excessive for purely theoretical research. Most damning were the corporate contracts I found buried in procurement records, agreements with Bell Laboratories, DuPont, Lockheed, and others that involved transfer of technical information derived from recovered materials. The contracts were structured as standard defense research partnerships, the kind that had been common during wartime development of radar and nuclear weapons. But the technical specifications being provided to these corporations included materials science and engineering principles that could only have come from analysis of the craft we'd recovered. We weren't just studying alien technology. We were systematically distributing it to private industry under classification protocols that ensured the source would never be acknowledged and the applications would eventually enter commercial markets as human innovations. The pattern became clear when I cross-referenced patent applications with technical breakthroughs documented in MJ-12 research reports. Bell Labs had filed preliminary patents on transistor technology in late 1947, shortly after the Roswell recovery, using semiconductor principles that matched components we'd found in the craft's control systems. DuPont's research into synthetic polymers suddenly accelerated in 1948 with the development of materials that bore suspicious similarity to the fiber structures in the craft's hull composition. Lockheed's advanced aircraft designs were incorporating geometric principles that I recognized from aerodynamic studies of the recovered craft, shapes that conventional engineering would never produce but which offered performance advantages that violated standard aerospace theory. We were seeding human technology with alien innovations, releasing them slowly enough that each advancement seemed like natural scientific progress, rather than reverse-engineered discoveries from crashed spacecraft. The strategy was brilliant in its comprehensiveness. By the time the technology reached public awareness, it would be so integrated into industrial infrastructure that its extraterrestrial origin would be impossible to prove and unnecessary to acknowledge. We'd have our technological advantage over the Soviets without ever admitting where it came from, and private corporations would profit from innovations they didn't actually invent, while serving as perfect cover for the true source of these breakthroughs. In September, I confronted Dr. Bush in his office after a research meeting where he'd dismissed my concerns about safety protocols with unusual brusqueness. I showed him copies of the documents I'd collected, the corporate contracts, the weapons development programs, the meeting minutes that revealed discussions I'd been excluded from. His reaction wasn't denial or surprise, but weary resignation, as if he'd been expecting this confrontation and had already decided how to handle it. "Bob," he said, with the kind of patience you'd use explaining reality to a child who still believed in fairy tales, "you're a brilliant engineer, but you're naive about how the world actually works. Yes, we're weaponizing this technology. Yes, we're preparing for confrontation with the Soviets from a position of overwhelming advantage. Yes, we're seeding corporate research with alien innovations without acknowledging the source. And yes, all of this was part of the plan from the beginning." He pulled out a bottle of bourbon from his desk drawer, something I'd never seen him drink during working hours, and poured 2 glasses without asking if I wanted one. Truman authorized defensive research, but defense means different things to different people. To scientists like you, defense means understanding threats and developing countermeasures. To people who operate at my level, defense means ensuring that America emerges from this Cold War as the uncontested global power, that Soviet communism gets crushed before it metastasizes into something we can't contain, and that American industrial and military supremacy gets locked in for the next century through technological advantages our enemies can't match or even comprehend. The technology we've recovered is worth more than truth, Bob. It's worth more than transparency or democratic principles or any of the ideals you think we're betraying. Because if we don't exploit this advantage, the Soviets will,
And I promise you won't like living in a world where Stalin's successors have gravity manipulation and unlimited energy. I tried to argue that Forrestal had been right, that this wasn't defense but aggression, that we were becoming exactly the kind of authoritarian power we claimed to be fighting against. Bush cut me off with a gesture that made it clear the discussion was over. Forrestal was troubled, Bob. Brilliant man, essential to the program's success, but ultimately unstable. His death was tragic but not surprising given his deteriorating mental state. The implication was clear. Questioning the program's direction led to classification as mentally unstable, and mental instability led to outcomes that were officially suicide but which might be something considerably less voluntary. You can continue as part of this program under the understanding that you execute assigned tasks without moral commentary, or you can be reassigned to work that doesn't require this level of clearance. But you can't have it both ways. You can't access this information and simultaneously object to how it's being used. That night, I added to my collection of letters that would never be sent, writing to Dorothy about discovering that the program I'd dedicated 2 years of my life to wasn't noble scientific research, but the foundation for American empire built on stolen technology and concealed casualties. I wrote about watching colleagues die in experiments that served political objectives rather than human understanding, about seeing technology that could revolutionize energy and transportation being weaponized instead of shared, about the realization that I'd become complicit in exactly the kind of authoritarian secrecy that totalitarian states use to maintain power over populations denied access to truth. I finished writing around 0300, burned the pages, and made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I would continue in the program, would document everything I could access, and would prepare for the day when this information could be released to people who deserved to know what their government had become in service of maintaining power that no human institution should possess. The activation began at 0317 hours on October 23, 1949, pulling me from restless sleep with alarm klaxons that indicated containment breach or critical systems failure. I reached the hangar where the Arizona craft was stored within 6 minutes, arriving to find it already surrounded by security personnel and research staff, all maintaining cautious distance from something that was behaving in ways we'd never observed before. Every system in the craft was active simultaneously, interior lighting pulsing in patterns that suggested communication rather than malfunction, surfaces generating those harmonic frequencies that made your bones ache with subsonic pressure, holographic displays materializing in the air above the hull, showing symbols and geometric forms that shifted too rapidly for human perception to track individually. This wasn't equipment failure or accidental activation. This was deliberate, coordinated, purposeful. The craft was receiving something. Dr. Carmichael arrived moments after I did, immediately recognizing that the symbol patterns were similar to the temporal notation she'd been decoding, but were appearing and evolving in real time rather than being static records. She started documenting with cameras and sketches, trying to capture information that was displaying at rates that suggested whoever was transmitting assumed receivers with processing speeds far exceeding human cognitive capabilities. The holographic projections weren't pictures or words but compressed data structures, three-dimensional information arrays that contained more meaning in single frames than human language could convey in paragraphs. It was like watching someone speak in a language where every syllable was a complete concept, and every pause contained entire conversations. The transmission, because that's clearly what this was, lasted 47 minutes before the systems began cycling down to dormant state, leaving us with recordings that would take months to fully analyze and experiential memories of witnessing communication that wasn't directed at us but which we'd accidentally intercepted. The sensation was profoundly unsettling. Standing in that hangar, watching alien technology respond to signals from sources we couldn't detect, realizing that whatever had built these craft was still out there, still active, still monitoring whatever experiment Earth represented. We were children who'd found adult communication devices and had just overheard conversations about matters we couldn't fully comprehend, but which clearly concerned us directly. Analysis began immediately, with every available researcher assigned to different aspects of the transmission. The visual components, the audio frequencies, the electromagnetic signatures, the way the craft's systems had responded in coordinated sequence. All of it suggested this wasn't random noise but structured communication following protocols that incorporated information density we couldn't match with any human technology. Dr. Carmichael focused on the symbol sequences, comparing them to her temporal map and finding correlations that suggested the transmission was updating the monitoring logs, adding new data to records that had been accumulating for millennia. It was a check-in, a status report, communication between monitoring equipment and whoever had deployed it to watch human development across geological timescales. What we eventually extracted from 47 minutes of transmission was fragmentary and required extensive interpretation, but the core message was clear enough to be terrifying. The communication wasn't coming from a single source, but from multiple origins, suggesting a network or collective rather than individual entities, consciousness that operated in distributed fashion across distances that might be interstellar or might be something else entirely. The content, translated through Carmichael's notation system and cross-referenced with the temporal maps we'd been studying, conveyed concepts that human language could only approximate through inadequate metaphors. Phase verification initiated appeared multiple times in various contexts, suggesting periodic assessment of whatever long-term process Earth represented. Not continuous monitoring, but scheduled check-ins at intervals that mattered to timescales we couldn't properly conceptualize, the way humans might check on crops seasonally rather than daily, assuming the growth follows expected patterns and requires minimal intervention. We were being verified, assessed against baseline expectations, measured for progress toward goals we hadn't been informed about because the beings conducting this assessment apparently didn't consider human awareness relevant to the evaluation process. Development parameters, within expected range, carried implications that made my hands shake while reading Carmichael's translation. We weren't exceeding expectations or falling behind schedule. We were developing exactly as predicted by whoever had seeded or modified or guided human evolution across the millennia, documented in those monitoring logs. Our technological advancement, our social structures, our population growth, our conflicts and achievements, all of it was apparently tracking along trajectories that had been modeled and anticipated by intelligence that understood human development better than we understood it ourselves. We thought we were making history through free will and innovation. They saw us following a growth curve they'd calculated thousands of years ago. Corrective intervention, not required this cycle, was perhaps the most disturbing phrase in the entire transmission because of what it implied about previous cycles and future possibilities. Not required suggested the option existed, that intervention was standard protocol when development deviated from acceptable parameters, that whatever oversight governed this monitoring program included mechanisms for adjusting human trajectory if we strayed too far from intended pathways. And this cycle implied periodicity, regular intervals at which intervention was considered and either implemented or deferred based on assessment criteria we couldn't identify. We were passing inspection, but the fact that inspection occurred meant failure was possible and came with consequences that the monitoring system was designed to address. The temporal marker that appeared most frequently in the transmission's closing sequences was the element that made long-term analysis simultaneously essential and potentially futile. Carmichael's best interpretation, accounting for the uncertainties inherent in translating alien calendrical systems into human chronology, placed the symbol somewhere between 2020 and 2030, roughly 70 to 80 years in our future, measured from when we were receiving this transmission in 1949. The context in which this marker appeared suggested it represented something significant: convergence of multiple monitored parameters, scheduled reassessment requiring different protocols than routine verification, or possibly the conclusion of whatever experimental timeline Earth represented. The beings conducting this monitoring had marked a date on their calendar when something would change, when observation would shift to intervention, or when the experiment would reach completion. I was so focused on Carmichael's analysis that I initially didn't notice the commotion at the far end of the hangar where medical personnel were attending to someone who'd collapsed. By the time I reached them, Dr. Bronk was already kneeling beside the prone figure, checking vital signs with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd dealt with neurological crisis related to the interface research. The subject was one of the surviving volunteers from the Human Experimentation Program, not Marcus Webb, who'd died 9 months earlier, but another pilot named Captain Frank Morrison, who'd participated in early interface trials and had shown similar sensitivity to the craft's systems, though with less severe immediate consequences. Morrison was conscious but unresponsive to verbal communication, his eyes tracking movements that weren't visible to anyone else in the hangar, his lips moving in patterns that produced sounds without being coherent speech. When Bronk attempted to assess his neurological status with standard reflex tests, Morrison suddenly grabbed the doctor's wrist with enough force to leave bruises and spoke with clarity that was shocking given his previous incoherence. "They're coming back." The voice had wrong harmonics, like Morrison was simultaneously translating from concepts that didn't map cleanly onto human phonetics. "Verification complete. Parameters acceptable. Return scheduled for harvest phase. 73 years, 4 months approximately. They're coming back to collect what they planted." The clarity lasted perhaps 30 seconds before Morrison's awareness fragmented again into that disconnected state where he seemed to be processing multiple streams of information simultaneously without being able to organize them into coherent human consciousness. Medical transported him to the facility's psychiatric ward, where he remained for the next 3 weeks, occasionally producing fragments of coherent speech that always carried the same essential message. The transmission hadn't been routine maintenance communication, but preparation for something more significant, a notice that the monitoring phase was approaching transition point, that whatever had been observing human development across millennia was preparing for more direct interaction when the scheduled timeline reached its conclusion. In the days following the transmission, I found myself experiencing dreams that didn't feel like normal sleep cognition, too structured, too coherent, containing information rather than just emotional processing of daily experiences. I dreamed about viewing Earth from orbital perspective, seeing human civilization as patterns of light and heat and electromagnetic radiation that were being measured against templates I couldn't consciously access. I dreamed about genetic sequences being compared to baseline parameters, about population distributions being evaluated for deviation from projected growth curves, about technological development being assessed against milestones that suggested human advancement was following a schedule someone else had written. Most disturbing was the recurring dream where I stood before entities whose physical form I couldn't perceive clearly, but whose presence communicated assessment and judgment, not hostile, not even particularly interested in me as an individual, just clinically evaluating whether the experiment designated Earth was proceeding according to plan. Dr. Carmichael spent weeks analyzing the transmission recordings, producing a comprehensive report that MJ-12 leadership immediately classified at levels that exceeded our normal operational security. The report's conclusions were unambiguous. The transmission represented scheduled communication from whatever network had deployed the monitoring stations we'd recovered, updating records and confirming that human development was tracking within acceptable parameters. The scheduled timeline suggested increased activity or direct intervention within roughly 75 years, corresponding to period in mid-2020s when whatever process Earth represented would reach critical milestones requiring different management protocols. The beings conducting this oversight had been observing us for at least 10,000 years and had apparently scheduled our species' development with same kind of long-term planning humans applied to agricultural projects or scientific experiments that required decades of patient observation. The psychological impact of the contact was profound across the research team. We'd spent 2 years analyzing recovered technology, hypothesizing about whoever had built it, speculating about their motivations and capabilities. But the transmission made it real in ways that crashed spacecraft and preserved occupants hadn't achieved. We'd heard from them directly, received communication that confirmed every disturbing hypothesis about Earth being under systematic observation by intelligence that viewed human civilization as experiment or project or harvest in progress. We weren't discovering evidence of alien visitation. We were confirming that visitation had never stopped, that we lived under surveillance we'd been too primitive to detect, that our entire species' history had been guided or at minimum monitored by beings who apparently intended to return for reasons we could only guess at, but which Morrison's translation suggested were related to collection of whatever we represented in their long-term planning. That night I added another letter to my collection of communications that would never be sent, writing to Dorothy about learning that humanity's development was apparently proceeding exactly as planned by intelligence that had scheduled our evolution across millennia and was preparing to return when we reached sufficient maturity for whatever purpose justified 10,000 years of patient observation. I wrote about the transmission's implicit message that free will might be illusion maintained by beings operating on timescales that made human choice look like deterministic behavior following programmed pathways, about the terrible knowledge that we were succeeding according to criteria we didn't understand toward goals we hadn't been informed about. I finished writing around 0400, burned the pages as security protocols required, and lay awake wondering whether the entities responsible for that transmission could perceive my thoughts, whether human consciousness was transparent to monitoring systems we couldn't detect, whether every moment of doubt and fear and desperate hope for meaning was being recorded in logs that would eventually be reviewed by beings who'd created or guided, or at minimum observed our entire species' journey from primitive consciousness to whatever we were becoming in preparation for scheduled contact that waited 75 years in a future I wouldn't survive to witness. The surveillance on my family began sometime in early November, though I didn't confirm it until December, when patterns became too consistent to attribute to coincidence. Dorothy mentioned during our weekly phone call that she'd noticed the same dark sedan parked near our house on multiple occasions, that the mailman seemed unusually interested in our correspondence, that conversations with neighbors had shifted in ways that suggested someone was asking questions about my work and travel. When I checked with contacts still friendly to within the security app, they confirmed what I'd suspected. My family was under active monitoring by elements within MJ-12's operational security, ostensibly to ensure I wasn't compromising classified information, but realistic established leverage in problematic evolving objective. The weight of knowledge become unbearable, normally difficult. I'd wake at night with my mind cycling through impossible options, each path leading to outcomes that ranged from personally catastrophic to potentially civilization-ending. Going public would mean immediate confiscation of evidence, character assassination through the same mechanisms that had declared Forrestal mentally unstable, and likely physical elimination disguised as accident or suicide. The government had demonstrated willingness to kill cabinet-level officials who threatened operational security. A mid-level engineer would disappear without anyone asking uncomfortable questions. But remaining silent meant complicity in deceptions that were shaping human technological development toward outcomes I couldn't predict, but which clearly served interests beyond democratic oversight or ethical consideration. I requested emergency meeting with President Truman through back channels that bypassed normal MJ-12 protocols, using connections from my wartime work that predated the program and might still be secure from whatever surveillance Bush's faction had established. The meeting was arranged for December 19th at Camp David, away from Washington, and the apparatus that had grown around the program, like parasitic organism, feeding on secrecy and unlimited authority. Truman looked older than I remembered from our first meeting just over 2 years earlier. The presidency had always been an aging job, but this seemed different, as if the weight of knowledge about what was really happening had accelerated deterioration beyond normal political stress. We met alone in a small study, just Truman and myself, with explicit orders that we weren't to be disturbed or recorded. The president listened for 90 minutes while I laid out everything, not just the technical discoveries, but the power structures that had developed around them, the corporate partnerships seeding alien technology into civilian infrastructure, the weaponization programs preparing for global conflict, using advantages our adversaries couldn't counter, and most significantly, the transmission's implications that human development was being monitored and managed toward scheduled harvest, approximately 75 years in our future. I showed him documents I'd copied in violation of every security protocol, Carmichael's analysis of the temporal markers, Morrison's translations suggesting we were crops being prepared for collection by intelligence that had been cultivating us for millennia. Truman's response wasn't disbelief, but despair. He'd suspected that MJ-12 had evolved beyond his control, but hadn't realized how far the deviation had progressed, or how completely the program had been captured by interests that served neither national defense nor human welfare. "Bob," he said, and his voice carried the exhaustion of man, discovering that his authority was theoretical rather than actual. "I authorized defensive research program. I didn't authorize shadow government, weaponization for aggressive war, or partnerships with private industry that will profit from technology we recovered from crashed spacecraft. But here's the terrible reality. I don't know if I can stop it. The people running MJ-12's operational components have resources and authorities that don't require my ongoing approval. They've built parallel structure that exists outside normal government oversight, funded through accounts I can't access. operating under classifications that bypass standard chain of command. I suggested exposing everything publicly, taking the case directly to Congress and American people through press conference that would force accountability and democratic oversight. Truman's reaction was immediate and unambiguous. And what happens then? Every church in America faces existential crisis when their congregations learn that humans might be genetic engineering project rather than God's special creation. Every government that bases legitimacy on national sovereignty confronts evidence that Earth has been under alien management for millennia. Social order collapses. Religious institutions fragment. International cooperation fails when everyone's trying to negotiate separate arrangements with potential overlords who might return within our children's lifetimes. He paused, staring out window at Maryland countryside. I've spent 5 years trying to prevent World War III while managing knowledge that makes nuclear weapons look like firecrackers. And now you're telling me that everything humans have accomplished might be following script written by intelligence that views us as agricultural project. The president's analysis led to question that neither of us could answer. Even if we could expose the truth, should we? The evidence suggested human civilization wasn't ready for cosmic perspective that reduced our entire history to footnote in someone else's experiment. The psychological trauma of learning that free will might be illusion, that our achievements were expected outcomes of genetic programming, that we existed to serve purposes we hadn't been informed about. These revelations could trigger collapse that would kill millions through panic and institutional failure, long before any scheduled harvest arrived. But concealment meant accepting that small group of unelected officials would make decisions about humanity's future based on incomplete understanding of forces they couldn't control, perpetuating systems of secrecy that had already murdered inconvenient truth-tellers and corrupted scientific research into weapons development. "Bob," Truman finally said after long silence, "I don't think there's right answer here. Only choices between different types of failure. We can expose everything and watch civilization tear itself apart through theological crisis and political chaos. We can try to shut down the program and watch it continue anyway under different names with even less oversight. Or we can document everything, prepare for eventual disclosure when humanity might be ready to process these truths, and hope that whoever's monitoring us finds our response adequate when they return for whatever they planned 75 years from now." He looked at me directly, and I saw in his eyes the same existential vertigo I'd been experiencing since Arizona Craft revealed its occupant. "I'm ordering full audit of MJ-12 operations, restructuring that will limit Bush's faction's autonomy, and establishment of backup documentation that will survive classification systems. But I can't completely dismantle what we've built, because the Soviet threat is real, and the technology we've recovered might be only thing preventing them from achieving first-mover advantage that ends American democracy. I'm asking you to stay inside, document everything you can access, and be ready to release that information if humanity survives long enough to need it." The meeting concluded with understanding that I would continue as part of MJ-12, but with different purpose, not advancing research but preserving evidence of what had really been discovered and how it was being misused. Truman provided me with security protocols for creating backup documentation outside official channels, contacts who might be trustworthy when the time came for disclosure, and implicit authorization to take actions that would violate every oath I'd sworn about protecting classified information. I left Camp David understanding that I'd been recruited into conspiracy within conspiracy, working to undermine program from inside while maintaining appearance of cooperation that would allow me access to information that needed preservation. December 1949 marked transition from scientist serving country to archivist preparing for future I wouldn't live to see. I began systematically copying documents, photographing materials with equipment I acquired through channels that wouldn't appear in procurement records, creating redundant archives that I dispersed to multiple locations where they might survive decades of classification and potential active suppression. Every technical report, every analysis of recovered materials, every meeting minute documenting how military and corporate interests had captured research program, all of it needed preservation because at some point, probably long after everyone involved was dead, humanity would need to know what had been discovered and how it had been concealed from democratic oversight and public knowledge. The work was dangerous in ways that made physical risk secondary to moral vertigo of actively betraying oaths and protocols I'd spent career respecting. I was committing espionage against country I'd served loyally, stealing information that was classified for what officials considered legitimate national security reasons, preparing to release secrets that might trigger exactly the civilizational collapse Truman feared, but continuing to serve a program that was using recovered technology to prepare for aggressive war, that was seeding corporate research with alien innovations while concealing their origin, that was preparing humanity for harvest by intelligence we couldn't resist through weapons development that might actually trigger intervention we wanted to avoid. That complicity felt worse than any betrayal of institutional loyalty. That night, I wrote a final letter to Dorothy that differed from all previous ones because I intended her to eventually receive this one, though not until circumstances made disclosure necessary, or my death made concealment pointless. I told her everything, not technical details, but essential truth about what I'd discovered, why I couldn't come home permanently, what I was trying to protect through actions that would look like betrayal if examined through conventional patriotic framework. I explained that the program I'd joined in service of national defense had become something that threatened everything I'd believed about American democracy and human dignity, that the knowledge we'd recovered came with moral obligations that superseded loyalty to institutions that were misusing it. I sealed the letter with instructions it should only be opened if I died under suspicious circumstances, or if certain temporal markers were reached, dates corresponding to when I calculated humanity might be ready to process these truths, or when scheduled contact made concealment impossible. By early January 1950, I'd established documentation systems that would preserve evidence through decades of potential suppression, created networks of contacts who might assist eventual disclosure, and positioned myself to continue accessing information while maintaining appearance of cooperation with program objectives. The choice I'd made wasn't noble or heroic. It was desperate compromise between options that all led to catastrophe of different varieties. I couldn't stop MJ-12's corruption, couldn't prevent technology seeding that was already transforming human capability, couldn't warn humanity about scheduled harvest without triggering collapse that might kill more people than any alien intervention. But I could bear witness, preserve truth, and hope that when the appointed time arrived 75 years hence, someone would have the wisdom to use information I was gathering toward purposes that served human survival rather than institutional power. Truman's audit revealed exactly what I'd documented: unauthorized weapons programs, corporate partnerships exceeding approved parameters, operational authorities that had metastasized beyond any democratic oversight. In February 1950, a classified executive order restructured MJ-12, replacing key personnel and establishing new oversight mechanisms designed to return the program to its original defensive research mandate. The response from Bush's faction wasn't compliance, but retaliation disguised as operational security. Within 6 weeks, 3 researchers who'd expressed concerns about program direction died in accidents that were individually plausible but collectively suspicious: car crash on icy roads, house fire attributed to faulty wiring, heart attack in a man with no prior cardiac history. My forced retirement came in April, framed as medical necessity due to exhaustion and stress-related health concerns that made continued work with classified materials inadvisable. The separation agreement required signing non-disclosure addendums more comprehensive than original security oaths, acknowledging that discussing any aspect of my work would constitute treason punishable by execution. They confiscated files from my office, searched my quarters, and conducted interview that was interrogation in everything but name. I surrendered documents they could find while protecting archives I'd hidden in locations they couldn't access without evidence they didn't possess. The systematic elimination continued through 1951. Dr. Carmichael died from barbiturate overdose, ruled suicide despite lack of psychiatric history or obvious motive. Captain Morrison, who translated the transmission's harvest warning, disappeared from the psychiatric facility, where he'd been held since October 1949. Official records showed discharge and relocation, but inquiries I made through remaining contacts suggested he'd never reached his supposed destination. And in March 1952, I learned that Marcus Webb, who I'd believed died in January 1949, had actually survived in severely compromised condition and been held in military medical facility until an accident during routine transport killed him, along with 2 attendants and a driver. The crash scene investigation was perfunctory, the bodies cremated quickly, and I understood that loose ends were being systematically eliminated. The Washington UFO flap in July 1952 provided bitter confirmation that the monitoring hadn't stopped just because we'd recovered some of their equipment. Multiple unidentified craft appeared on military radar over the capital for consecutive weekends, performing maneuvers that violated known physics, observed by civilians and military personnel who couldn't all be discredited or silenced. The official explanation involved weather phenomena and radar anomalies, but I knew exactly what was happening. They were conducting visual inspection, updating their monitoring with direct observation now that humanity had developed enough to potentially notice their presence. The verification was continuing on schedule, assessing whether we remained within acceptable development parameters or required intervention before the scheduled return. The assassination attempt came in August, clumsy enough that I survived through luck rather than skill. Brake failure on a mountain road that should have killed me but resulted only in serious injuries when my truck struck a tree at reduced speed because I'd been driving cautiously. The accident investigation found nothing conclusive, but the mechanic who'd serviced my truck 2 days earlier disappeared before I could interview him. I understood the message. Stay silent, or next time the accident would succeed. Dorothy was terrified by the crash, and my explanation that I'd made dangerous enemies through government work I couldn't discuss. Our children were teenagers who understood their father had survived something that wasn't really accident, and I saw in their eyes the beginning of questions I couldn't answer without risking their lives as well as my own. By September 1952, staying in Montana meant accepting eventual assassination whenever Bush's faction decided the risk of my testimony outweighed the risk of obvious murder. I made contact with allies Truman had connected me with, people who understood that preservation of information mattered more than my personal safety, and arranged disappearance so thorough that even family would believe I'd died. The staged death involved car going off cliff into river deep enough that recovery would be difficult and identification unreliable. Dorothy received death certificate, life insurance payout, and condolences from military representatives who expressed appreciation for my classified service while providing no details about what I'd actually done. The truth was that I'd relocated to Albuquerque under assumed identity, living in modest apartment as retired engineer named Robert Jackson, working occasional consulting jobs that provided income while maintaining anonymity. My family believed I was dead, which was the only way to ensure their complete safety from people who demonstrated willingness to murder inconvenient witnesses and their relatives. The guilt of that deception was balanced against certainty that my survival as Robert Hargrove would eventually result in threats against Dorothy and our children that I couldn't protect them from while maintaining access to information that needed preservation. I spent the next decades watching from outside as the program continued under different designations. Majestic evolved into Aquarius, then into Zodiac, each reorganization providing fresh classification that ensured previous revelations couldn't be connected to current operations. The technology seeding continued, transistors becoming integrated circuits, becoming microprocessors, each advancement looking like human innovation while actually representing incremental release of capabilities we'd reverse engineered from recovered craft. I documented what I could access through remaining contacts, maintained archives that grew more comprehensive as years passed, and my perspective lengthened into understanding of patterns that required decades to manifest. The hardest part was watching humanity march toward the scheduled timeline without any ability to warn them, observing as we developed precisely the technologies and social structures that the monitoring suggested we were expected to develop, knowing that in 2025, give or take a few years depending on how accurately Carmichael had translated their calendrical markers, something would change. The experiment would reach conclusion. The harvest would be initiated, or whatever metaphor best captured what beings who'd cultivated us for 10,000 years intended to do when we ripened sufficiently. And I would be dead by then, having preserved evidence that might help whoever remained understand what had happened and why, but unable to prevent or even properly warn about scheduled contact that I'd learned about in 1949, but which wouldn't manifest until 75 years later when everyone who'd known the truth would be safely deceased. 67 years is a long time to live with secrets that could rewrite human history, watching the world change in ways you recognize as guided rather than organic, knowing that every technological breakthrough celebrated as human achievement actually represents controlled release of capabilities we recovered from crashed spacecraft in 1947. I've lived under assumed identity since 1952, dying officially, so I could continue documenting what they tried to bury. Dorothy passed in 1987 without ever knowing I'd survived. That guilt still wakes me some nights. My children, now elderly themselves, believe their father died serving his country. They're not wrong, just incomplete in their understanding of which truths I died protecting. The technology seeding I witnessed from the beginning continued exactly as planned. Bell Labs announced the transistor in 1947, mere months after Roswell, using semiconductor principles identical to components we'd extracted from the craft's control systems. I watched them accept Nobel Prizes for innovations they'd reverse-engineered from wreckage they couldn't acknowledge existed. The laser emerged in 1960 from Hughes Aircraft, its operating principles matching the communication systems we'd documented at Wright Field. Kevlar appeared in 1965 from DuPont, synthetic fiber, with properties suspiciously similar to the hull materials that had defied every attempt at replication using known chemistry. ARPANET's architecture in 1969 incorporated networking concepts that I recognized from Carmichael's analysis of how the monitoring craft communicated, distributed systems with no single point of failure, packet switching that seemed obvious only after you'd seen it implemented in technology that predated human civilization. Fiber optics, stealth geometry, integrated circuits. Each advancement arrived on schedule, released to corporate partners who would never admit the true origin of their patents. I kept detailed records correlating official invention dates with classified research timelines, building comprehensive documentation of how alien technology was systematically integrated into human infrastructure while maintaining fiction of organic innovation. The program itself evolved through successive reorganizations designed to obscure continuity and prevent comprehensive oversight. Majestic became Aquarius, which became Zodiac, which became Designation. I stopped being able to track as my access to inside information deteriorated with time and generational turnover in personnel. But the essential structure remained constant. Small group with unlimited resources, operating beyond democratic accountability, managing knowledge that could destabilize civilization while using that knowledge to ensure American technological and military dominance. I documented what I could from outside, maintaining networks with people who still believed documentation mattered more than institutional loyalty. The hardest part wasn't the isolation or the guilt about family that believed I was dead. It was watching humanity march blindly toward the timeline I knew was coming, developing exactly the capabilities that suggested we were following programmed developmental pathway, approaching thresholds that would trigger whatever response the monitoring species had scheduled for mid-2020s. Every space program milestone, every advancement in genetic engineering, every step toward artificial intelligence looked like progress, but felt like checking boxes on someone else's list of requirements we needed to meet before they returned to assess our maturity. In 2017, everything changed in ways that confirmed my worst fears. UFO activity increased dramatically. Military encounters that couldn't be dismissed, radar confirmations from multiple independent sources, pilot testimony that bypassed official suppression because social media had created communication channels that classified damage control couldn't contain effectively. The Navy released footage of encounters off California and Florida, objects performing maneuvers that violated physics as we understood it, moving in ways that matched exactly what I'd seen in 1947, except now the monitoring had become obvious enough that concealment required more effort than revelation. They were making their presence known, conducting verification in ways that couldn't be explained away as weather balloons or atmospheric anomalies. The patterns matched historical precedent perfectly. Increased activity preceding 1947's crashes. Same kind of systematic observation that suggested preparation for something more significant than routine monitoring. I watched the 2017-2019 revelations with certainty that this was preliminary to scheduled contact, that they were assessing current capabilities before initiating whatever protocol governed transition from observation to intervention or harvest or whatever came next in experimental timelines spanning millennia. Humanity was approaching 75 years since the transmission that had marked us for scheduled reassessment, and the reassessment was visibly beginning. I'm 90 years old as I make these final recordings in April 2019, dying from cancer that medical science can't cure, despite all our celebrated technological advancement. The irony isn't lost on me. We've integrated alien technology into everything from communications to materials science. But we still die from cellular mutations that our supposedly advanced medicine can't prevent or repair. I've spent months gathering documentation I've preserved across 67 years, organizing it for release that will probably come after my death because releasing it while alive would trigger suppression that might destroy evidence before it could reach people who need to see it. The recordings you're hearing now represent comprehensive testimony about what was discovered in 1947, how it was concealed and exploited, what we learned about humanity's place in cosmic order that includes intelligence that's been monitoring us for at least 10,000 years. I provided copies of classified documents, photographs of recovered materials, technical analyses showing how civilian technology was seeded from alien sources, and most significantly, Carmichael's translation of the temporal markers indicating that we're approaching scheduled contact within the next few years, possibly as early as 2023, probably no later than 2027, based on uncertainties in calendrical conversion. The increased UFO activity since 2017 isn't random. It's verification preceding scheduled intervention, assessment of whether human development has proceeded according to parameters that whoever's been cultivating us considers acceptable. We're being inspected before harvest, evaluated before collection, judged according to criteria we weren't informed about, but which we've apparently been following with disturbing precision. Every technological milestone we've celebrated as human achievement was actually expected outcome of genetic and cultural programming that's been guiding our species toward purposes we still don't fully understand, but which the monitoring species apparently considers important enough to justify millennia of patient observation. I don't know if we'll pass their assessment. I don't know if passing is even desirable. Maybe failing means we're left alone to develop according to our own chaotic trajectories, rather than being incorporated into whatever system they've been preparing us for. But I fear that we won't have that choice, that the scheduled timeline will proceed regardless of our readiness or preference, that contact will happen on their terms according to their schedule, because we've never been partners in this arrangement. We've been subjects, specimens, crops being cultivated toward harvest that was marked on their calendar before human civilization learned to write. If you're hearing these recordings, I'm probably already dead. The cancer will claim me naturally, or the suppression systems that have been trying to silence witnesses since 1949 will arrange accident or suicide that looks plausible enough that investigation won't reveal murder. Either way, my testimony survives because I've distributed copies to multiple recipients with instructions for release under various trigger conditions. If I die naturally and nothing catastrophic happens by 2027, release them anyway. Humanity deserves to know what's been concealed and what's approaching before the scheduled contact makes concealment impossible. To whoever receives this after my death, protect these recordings, preserve the documentation, and understand that the truth I'm sharing isn't about vindicating conspiracy theories or proving that government lies to citizens. It's about preparing humanity for contact that's coming, whether we're ready or not. The beings who've been monitoring us for 10 millennia are returning for scheduled assessment, and we have perhaps 5 to 8 years to decide whether we want to meet them as informed participants or ignorant subjects who never understood what was really happening to their species across the entire span of recorded history. I've spent 72 years carrying these secrets, watching humanity develop precisely as programmed, documenting concealment and exploitation of knowledge that could have transformed how we understood our place in cosmos. I'm tired, I'm dying, and I'm ready for whatever comes after this life ends. But before I go, I needed to create testimony that might help whoever remains understand what's been hidden, why it was hidden, and what's approaching as we reach the 75th anniversary of discoveries that changed everything, while changing nothing because the truth was buried so deeply that it might as well have never been recovered. They're coming back. The verification is already underway. And this time, I fear that humanity won't pass the test. Not because we've failed to develop sufficiently, but because we've developed in exactly the ways they programmed us to develop, while losing whatever qualities might have made us worth preserving as something more than agricultural product or experimental data. We followed the script perfectly, advanced on schedule, integrated their technology seamlessly into our civilization. And in doing so, we may have proven that we're exactly what they designed us to be. Successful experiment that's now ready for whatever purpose justifies 10,000 years of careful cultivation. This is Robert James Hargrove, recording on April 23, 2019, from location I won't disclose, carrying knowledge I couldn't share until now, hoping that testimony survives suppression and reaches people before scheduled contact makes every secret obsolete. If this recording exists, I didn't survive to see it published, but you're hearing it now, and that means something went right. Protect this information, share it carefully, and prepare for contact that's coming whether we believe in it or not. Because the beings who've been watching us for millennia have marked our calendar, and they keep their appointments with agricultural precision. The truth was always out there. We just weren't allowed to see it until the harvest was ready to begin.